Guard. He'll describe the Guard's role in the war on terrorism. Now to Thomas Barnett. He's a professor at the Naval War College. This summer he spoke at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. His two-part presentation is about 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Davis, professor in the War Studies Department and executive director of the Center for Strategic Leadership Development. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the third event in the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Last February, the Commandant hosted 20 chief executive officers from corporations and associations instrumental to crafting the tools and capabilities the Defense Department relies on to maintain the nation's security. Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Paul Wolfowitz, and Air Force Chief of Staff, General John Jumper, presented their strategic estimates of the national security situation. These included their insights into not only the ongoing operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the longer-range war on terrorism and the need for defense transformation. This event was followed immediately by an honoring of one of ICAF's most famous alumni, General John Vesey, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We dedicated the other auditorium in this college to General Vesey and recognized his many accomplishments with an honorary doctorate. General Vesey, in turn, honored us with an insightful and inspiring lecture from this very stage. Today's symposium is our opportunity to focus on the present and contemplate what it will mean to lead in the emerging environments. We have titled the symposium Strategic Thinking in Complex Environments. One thing we have emphasized this entire academic year is how thinking strategically differs from the focus of our daily operational lives. Let me suggest for this symposium that thinking strategically means to think about how we think and what we think about, to consider our basic values and beliefs of how and why things occur as they do. We don't have time to do this as a matter of routine in our operationally demanding lives. But such strategic thinking is critically important in these complex and turbulent times. We will spend this morning with Dr. Thomas Barnett, a strategic researcher and professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He will focus our attention on critical national security issues and propose transformational solutions as he develops strategies for combating global uncertainties and their associated risks. After lunch, we will be joined by Ms. Laura Anderson, a national partner for strategy and development of KPMG in Melbourne, Australia, an expert in strategic planning, risk management, and capability planning. Ms. Anderson has an international reputation for innovation. Following Laura, we will hear from Mr. Greg Cudahy, the Global Director of B2B, Business to Business and Supply Chain Optimization for the international consultant Capgemini, one of the leading global management and information technology consulting firms in the world. Mr. Cudahy manages the largest supply chain consultancy in the world. Immediately following his lecture, Mr. Cudahy will be rejoined by Dr. Barnett and Ms. Anderson for a short panel discussion in which the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions to which the three will be able to respond. We conclude the symposium tomorrow morning with a lecture by Mr. Chris Meyer, Chief Executive Officer of Monitor Networks, a new part of the Michael Porter's Monitor Group. Mr. Meyer's entire career has been at the cutting edge of knowledge management and information technology applications for adaptive enterprises. You may be familiar with 3 books he has co-authored with Stan Davis: Blur, Future Wealth, and It's Alive. Our hope is that this symposium will heighten your awareness of the strategic considerations that must be dealt with by leaders of business, the military, and governments as you manage through the uncertainties and risks of the complex environments that are co-evolving at unprecedented rate. So let us begin. Dr. Tom Barnett earned his PhD in political science from Harvard. He received his on-the-job training, if you will, as a project director at the Center for Naval Analysis. He has been a research project director at the Naval War College for over a decade and directed the New Rule Sets project in partnership with Cantor Fitzgerald. Dr. Barnett is the author of the new book that's causing quite a stir around Washington, The Pentagon's New Map, War and Peace in the 21st Century. Without further ado, let me introduce the person that Vice Admiral Art Zebrowski, the director of the Office of Transformation for Secretary Rumsfeld, refers to as my strategy guy. Tom.
I like to describe the brief and this presentation as the product of about a 6-year conversation with Art Zebrowski, in addition to a long mentoring relationship I've had or enjoyed with Hank Gaffney at the Center for Naval Analyses, and a similar relationship with retired 4-star Admiral Bud Flanagan, recently of Cantor Fitzgerald. The way I like to describe the conversation with Art is to note that we came to the War College at roughly the same time, summer of 1998. He had a list of things he wanted us to study. At the top of that list, obviously, net-centric warfare. At that point, more glimmer in his eye than the dogma it has become throughout the Pentagon. At the bottom of that list was a very odd subject: the potential for the year 2000 problem to serve as a security situation around the planet. As the most recent hire and the professor with the least standing, I was given that project. It turned out to be the most fascinating project I'd ever done. It was a grand exploration of how we think about instability and crisis in this interconnected world. And that's really how Art Zebrowski saw it. He saw it as a heuristic opportunity, an opportunity for teaching and learning, because he knew there'd be unprecedented discussions between the Defense Department and the rest of the U.S. government, between the government and the private sector, and between America and the world. So we created a project, and we called it the Year 2000 International Security Dimension Project. We came up with a series of scenarios, both good and bad. Our worst case scenario was pretty fantastic. Got us a lot of interesting press. I was dubbed the Nostradamus of the Navy. Jack Anderson, the muckraking journalist, wrote an expose on my secretly training the U.S. government and the Marine Corps to take over society in the event of chaos on January 1st. And he had pictures. My wife said, if you can do all that from your desk at Newport, why can't you take out the garbage on Tuesdays like I ask? Our worst case scenario, pretty fantastic. Wall Street shut down for a week. Air travel in the United States shut down for about 10 days. A surge in hate crimes against ethnic groups identified as part of the problem. Surge in gun buying. Islanding of certain services, especially insurance. Breakdowns in just-in-time supply chains. A terrible description of January 1, 2000. A very prescient description, September 12, 2001. It wasn't because we were predicting anything. I was scheduled to be on the 105th floor of the World Trade Center 2 weeks to the day after 9/11. So obviously we weren't predicting the trigger. But we had thought long and hard about the horizontal scenarios that would emerge from that vertical shock. Now, we were approached by Cantor Fitzgerald in the midst of this workshop series. They had done a series of workshops with the War College in the early 1990s, looked at a war in the Persian Gulf, looked at a financial crisis beginning in Southeast Asia, looked at a terrorist strike downtown Manhattan. So we were pretty impressed with their thinking ahead capabilities. They said, we think we've seen this Y2K beast before. We said, really, what did it look like? They said, we think we saw it in the Asian flu. And we said, boy, that does not compute. We're talking about a software failure. You're talking about a financial panic. The way I translated what they said to me next was essentially, we like to look at the world in terms of rule sets. What's a rule set? Hockey has a rule set. American football has a rule set. The U.S. legal system has a rule set. The U.S. military has a rule set. You walk into these venues, you know what the rules are, basically. And their argument for the 1990s, which they said was similar to the 1920s, was that rule sets were out of whack. That in the process of expanding the global economy so dramatically across the 80s and 90s, economic rule sets raced ahead of political rule sets. And technological rule sets, and connectivity in general, raced ahead of security rule sets. In effect, we wired up much faster than we had the ability to keep pace with in terms of the political and security rule sets. And their fear with Y2K was that it would be something cataclysmic and that it would crystallize our understanding of those rule sets out of whack, and that there would be a period of tremendous rule set catch-up at that point. We do a workshop with Cantor Fitzgerald, Windows on the World, 107th floor, World Trade Center 1, 1999. They like it so much, they say, let's do a series on globalization itself. We'll call it the New Rule Sets Project. We're going to focus on developing Asia, because in their mind, the integration of roughly half the world's population since 1980 is changing rule sets all over the planet. Best place to catch it, frankly, Wall Street Journal. And you have to extrapolate back in the direction of the New York Times and security, and back in the direction of the Washington Post and politics, which frankly is the slowest of the three in terms of dealing with change. So we did a series of workshops on developing Asia. One was on energy, one was on foreign direct investment, one was on environmental damage. Everything I read in the Wall Street Journal today, I heard about from Wall Street about 5-6 years ago. So again, I find their intelligence networks very impressive. This project gets shot out from under us, somewhat literally, on 9/11. Cantor loses between 650 and 700 people. At that point, I'm footloose and fancy-free. Art Zebrowski's just retired as a 3-star, goes to work for Secretary Rumsfeld as his transformation guru, asked me to come work for him. I said, my wife told me I could marry my divorce attorney and move back to Washington anytime I damn well pleased. And he said, don't worry, I'm the father of net-centric warfare. Here's a cell phone, it's called Southwest to BWI. And about 200 flight credits later, this briefing exists. What Art asked me to do in this briefing was to give him a larger context, to elevate the discussion of transformation beyond the whack list, as in what gets cut. As he likes to tell people, America doesn't have a grand strategy. I needed one for my job, so I outsourced the function to Barnett. And that's what this brief became. Audacious beyond belief. Purposely so, though. We briefed it throughout OSD, throughout the Defense Department. I've given it almost 200 times to about 5,000-6,000 people. Briefed Secretary Rumsfeld senior people. Art takes care of the people above that. Briefed Secretary Powell senior people. Art takes care of the stuff above that. Briefed Congress, briefed the House of Commons in England. Getting a lot of good purchase in the information technology and banking communities, which tend to get this material even better than we do, even better than I do. It becomes an article, March 2003, Esquire. Gets passed around a lot. I get an agent. That agent gets me a book. 28 today, Amazon. I got to give it to Brian Lamb. Wall Street Journal got me to 40. Brian Lamb got me to 6 in 24 hours. On a Memorial Day weekend, too. So he impresses me to no end. Okay, the purpose of the brief, in many ways, is to try to find the interface between war and peace. I was asked by the Singaporean version of Art Sabrowski, what's the difference between your work and Andy Marshall's work? Director, Office of Net Assessment. I said what Mr. Marshall does and what his office does is it thinks about the future of war within the context of war, which I think is very important. I say what I do, and I think what this office does, this Office of Force Transformation needs to do, is think about the future of warfare within the context of everything else. And I think the everything else becomes more and more important as we understand this global war on terrorism within the larger context of the spreading of globalization. So here we go. I'm going to give you my quick history of the 20th century. I'm going to talk about globalization 1. I'm going to date it from 1870. I'll take it up to 1929 to keep it simple. First great coming together of the global economy. I'll say somewhat facetiously, we screw the pooch one afternoon on Wall Street. We create a systemic stress we later call the Great Depression. From that, as an economic determinist, I'll argue we get World War II. Because it wasn't just Nazi shenanigans. It wasn't just the harshness of Versailles. It was the economy, stupid, that destroyed this beautifully designed Weimar Republic. People in my field, political science, will tell you that it began in its modern form with the question, why did the Weimar Republic fail? At the end of the Second World War, America decides we're going to firewall ourselves off from this horrible experience. Not just the Holocaust, never again, but the economic nationalism of the 1930s, which killed this first great coming together of the global economy, sent all those indices of integration quite literally back to zero. We institute what we like to call a new rule set. Resource flows, strategic alliances, the biggest reorganization of the U.S. government up until that point in history, the international organizations we create. So I'm talking Defense Act, 1947, creation of DOD, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Marshall Plan, the Strategy of Containment, a massive new collection of rules. It took us about a decade to figure out. Ostensibly, this package was put together to contain the Soviet threat. Sub rosa, the real goal was to recreate globalization, quite explicitly on three key pillars: North America, Japan, Western Europe. Now, if you listen to the World Bank around 1980, you begin to see the so-called new globalizers. We call them emerging markets after the 87 crash, because all that boomer money's looking for a higher outcome. These emerging markets, these 24 new globalizers, doesn't sound like a lot in a world population of almost 200 states, except it's half the world's population. And a new era of globalization is born. So Deng really turns history, really pivots it in China. Now the Berlin Wall comes down. Seemingly everybody on the same rule set page, end of history. Maybe a clash of civilizations. And we see a spiking of ethnic conflict in the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But seemingly everybody on the same rule set page as we proceed into the 90s, massive expansion of the global economy. The question we began asking, do we encounter new stresses across the 90s that call into question what was the new rule set for the late 1940s, early 1950s, now starts to look a little long in the tooth, because that rule set was put together to prevent the collapse of Globalization 1, not necessarily to further the advance of Globalization 2, which I will argue is quantitatively different. In Globalization 1, for example, labor much more fluid across borders, money not nearly as much as it is today, and no global integrated production. First big hint for me, Mexican pesos crisis, 1994. It seemed like a lot more than just a financial panic. Other examples, rapid climate change, computer viruses with global impact, the rise of catastrophic terrorism. So this rule set put together to prevent this sort of great power war Clearest example, permanent members, veto-wielding members, UN Security Council, the winning coalition from World War II. Why? We were concerned they might go back to war with one another. They had been through 2 world wars at that point, killed tens of millions. Not exactly the problem set we face today. So what we were interested in thinking about when we first drew this slide back with the Y2K work in the summer of 1998 was to ask what could be a catalytic event coming down the pike that would crystallize a sense of rule sets out of control. Were we talking the same level of destruction as World War II? No. But the same level of disruption on some points. Meaning lots of new rules would come in its aftermath. Tremendous rules. Now we were interested in Y2K, and we were interested in the tech crash, because we could see the new rules coming in the financial sector. But if you talk to people on Wall Street, they'll tell you there's a financial panic roughly every 13, 14 years in the United States, a crash. Why? Because you get far enough away from the last crash, pretty soon you only have stockbrokers, which is a young person's game, who can't remember what that last crash looked like. And the further they get from that last crash, they start talking about new rules, new ways of doing things, new realities, which we typically discover after the crash involve lying, cheating, stealing. And you get a rule set reset. So we could see that with the tech crash. But that was only going to impact the financial sector. And again, it was regular. We were looking for something really unprecedented that would impact the political and security fields. I think we get it with 9/11. And I could draw a line I've been thinking about for 5 years. Lots of new rule sets since 9/11. I could still pick up a New York Times, a Wall Street Journal, a Washington Post, and in every single day find you a story about some amazing new rule set that redefines the nature of privacy, how we handle information, definitions of criminal behavior, definitions of un-American behavior, new definitions of war. How can I tell we're in a rule set reset? We can't even decide what to call the enemy or where we can try them. I was having breakfast this morning. I thought, how hard would it be to find? Page 1, business section. Ongoing story. Database on U.S. visitors set for huge expansion. The creation of a virtual border. Price tag, they're guessing $15 billion over 10 years. Did we need this before 9/11? Apparently. But 9/11 crystallized the sense of a rule set gap. And so we have been filling rule set gaps with great abandon ever since. Patriot Act is a rule set reset. Preemption strategy is a serious rule set change. The biggest rule set we've created in national security since we invented the concept of mutual assured destruction and spent about a decade selling it to the Soviets. But it's not just a matter of closing the door on the hazy, crazy 1990s, which I believe, along with Cantor, will go down. Very similar, historically, in descriptions, as the 1920s. I say if that was globalization 1, if that was 2 and 3, what this country needs to ask is, what do we want in globalization 4? We're the world's biggest economy. Either we seek to define this as much as possible, or we let it define us by default. Now, we had the so-called wise men, your George Kennans, your Chip Bolins and whatnot, your Dean Achesons. In the aftermath of the Second World War, they looked around the planet. They said, we've lived through 2 world wars. Where are the major sources of violence and insecurity in the system? And they decided, not surprisingly, it was Germany, Japan, Soviet Russia. And so they put together a package to buy off the first 2, wait out the third. They structured a future. They restructured the U.S. national security establishment to meet that future. And their dream, an amazing dream, was that maybe by the end of the century, Japan and Germany would be so pacified we'd never have to worry about them again in terms of great power war. And maybe the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and join our rule set. An amazing vision from that perspective, which takes half a century, but we actually pull it off. Along the way, a transformative event. creating the huge disparity between us and the rest of the world. We moved to an all-volunteer force. We professionalize. We solve the problem that has bedeviled militaries throughout history: how to get the Army to actually cooperate with the Navy. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security is another transformative event, but that's largely an inside job. We have to locate transformation within a global vision. We outspend the world on defense. We're spending over $450 billion a year. If all you really want to do is defend this country, I could do it for about $100 billion, I'm certain. So why are we spending $350 billion extra? I will argue we're conducting a transaction with the outside world. We're selling a product. And the world is buying that product when it buys our debt. For example, we float $130 billion, U.S. Treasuries. First quarter 2003, 4/5 of it was bought by foreigners. Two biggest buyers, Japan, China. Two countries with huge dependencies on Middle Eastern oil. That was a transaction. Whether we realize it or not, you can call that war unilateral, but it was actually paid for somebody else, by somebody else. And if we don't understand that transaction and don't understand the service we provide in the course of that transaction, we're waging war strictly within the context of war and not understanding it within the context of everything else. Now, one definition of transformation is you have today's military capabilities, and what you're going to do is you're going to whack off what you don't need, about 5% a year, add on what you do need on the far end, and in 20 years, you've got a new military. But of course, direction's implied. You have to know tooth from tail. You have to have a definition of the future of war. I will tell you the dominant definition of the future of war inside the Pentagon today is the same one we've had for about 10 years. It's China, Taiwan Straits, 2025. Why? It's a familiar image. China's big, it's bad, and it's allegedly communist. I say we have to find transformation within a larger global vision, a vision that speaks to all these points. Now, inside the Pentagon, November 2001, I'd throw those bullets up on the wall. People would say, slow down, you're getting ahead of yourself. There's no way all that stuff's on the table. No way. Nobody argues any of these bullets anymore because everybody understands they're all on the table. All these things are being changed. In many ways, what we're searching for is an understanding of a new definition of the American way of not just war, but peace. We have an unprecedented capacity to wage war. Nobody even comes close. We do not have nearly the same capacity to wage peace as we've seen in Iraq since May of last year. I will argue that we've been exporting security around the planet 60 years. For the biggest chunk of that time period, we had a competitor in the process. If we exported too much to a particular country or region, he got pissed off. If he did it, we got pissed off. He went away in 1990. Demand for our services skyrocketed. Here's the best measure I've developed, working for Hank Gaffney at CNA Corporation as a consultant. I'm going to talk about combined service crisis response days, meaning if the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Army all send troops to, say, Somalia for 100 days each, I'm going to call that 4 times 100 equals 400 cumulative combined crisis response days from the services. Billable hours, which I think is the best measurement. Not bombs dropped, billable hours. Not just because we value our people more than anything else, but because they cost more than anything else. Here are some numbers. Here are some decades. 70s, roughly 10,000 days, not including Vietnam, ongoing conflict. So we're focusing on crisis response with some level of combat, so not humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. 80s, rough doubling, spiking in interstate war across the system, according to the great data from University of Maryland. Soviets go away, demand for our services increase 4 to 5-fold. Best definition I found of a military under real stress. across the 90s. How did we deal with that spike? A variety of ways. We outsourced to contractors all the Brown and Roots. We created a new category, military operations other than war. And frankly, we simply denied it. And our denial was dubbed the Powell Doctrine, which said, we don't go into any situation unless we have a clear exit strategy. Meaning as soon as the guns stop shooting, we're out of there as quickly as possible. I'm going to draw a line here. Everything below it, basically cats and dogs. You're going to do this every decade no matter what. Like our every decade intervention in Haiti. General George Barnett, my second cousin, was ousted as Commandant of the Marine Corps at the end of the First World War because of excessive force used by the Marines in Haiti. Some things never change. Everything above that line is a choice. We decided to go into the Middle East across the 1980s. Iran, Iraq, the tanker wars, Israel into Lebanon, terrorism. We decided to keep Saddam in a box in a 12-year shooting war across which we dropped bombs almost every single day. We decided to dismember the former Republic of Yugoslavia. We decided to engage in so-called massive nation-building efforts, Somalia and Haiti. And you can see what kind of job we did in Haiti. What was the actual demand for our services? I would argue it was somewhere north of 250,000 days. This is what we managed. The question we ask is, did we use that asset, which is the most important asset we have, the time and the attention the Defense Department plays or spends on any region's potential or actual instances of mass violence? What did we get for that expenditure? Now I'm going to give you the core gap argument from the Esquire article, The Pentagon's New Map, which got me on a lot of television, generated more hate mail than I could possibly read. I'm going to give you a stretching argument. I'm going to say, if we go back to the beginning of the Cold War, where we had our stuff and where we did our business was largely in sync. We had our stuff and we did our business in Western Europe. Think Berlin crises. We had our stuff and we did our business in Northeast Asia. Think about MacArthur. Think about Korea. Think about a bridge too far in Vietnam. Basic containment strategy. Box the Soviets in on either side. Preserve Japan. Preserve Western Europe. 4 key events across the 1970s shift our attention to the middle of the world. So the fact that we're trying to transform the Middle East shouldn't be a surprise, because we've been trying to do something there positive for roughly 30 years and failing dramatically. 4 key events shove us to that part of the world. First, the European détente settles the question of superpower rivalry between us and the Soviets, sends that competition south with the fall of the Portuguese Empire in 1975, sub-Saharan Africa. The Soviets get countries of socialist orientation, we counter with the Reagan Doctrine. 73 war alerts us to the functioning of the global economy, the rise of OPEC, the beginnings of oil as a strategic weapon, so to speak. I could show you the crisis response from European Command, EUCOM, that shifts from one side of the Med to the other across the 1970s. Same thing happens on the other side of the earth. Vietnam ends, follow the Shah of Iran. I could show you the crisis response data from U.S. Pacific Command, shifts from one side of Asia to the other. We discovered this because we stopped responding to typhoons in the Pacific across the 1980s. Excuse me, across the late 1970s. And we actually went back and looked at some of the meteorological data to see if there were less typhoons in the Pacific in the late 1970s, early 1980s. The answer was they are always there, same frequency. Our ships just weren't around to respond to them in the same degree that they were previous. So they were the trees falling in the forest with nobody to hear them, because we had shifted to Southwest Asia. By the time we create CENTCOM here in the early 1980s, over 55% of the cumulative combined crisis response days for the 4 services inside that red circle. For the Navy and Marine Corps, 75%. Our market had shifted. Now the Bush administration comes in. They accuse the Clinton administration of focusing too much on the big pieces of the international financial architecture, not paying enough attention to the international security architecture. Decent argument. And they come in pretty much decided that China is the long-term near-peer competitor, the threat against which we have to size our forces. There I have a problem with the logic. And the new rule sets work. All I did was go between the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And what I heard at the World Trade Center was China, future of integration, future of investment, future of deals. And then I would go to the Pentagon and say, China, future of danger, threat, and war. Which is why we tried to get these two groups to sit across tables and actually talk to one another. Because the Pentagon's map and Wall Street's map overlapped very precipitously in China. All that gets wiped off the map with 9/11. China's a huge beneficiary. A huge beneficiary. I draw a new map on 9/11. I'm going to use this phrase, functioning. I'm going to say a country or region is functioning if the following characteristics are roughly met. First, it welcomes both the connectivity and can handle the content flows that come with that connectivity and globalization. Everybody likes connectivity. Bin Laden likes connectivity. Loves to get on Al Jazeera. Not everybody can handle the content flows. Good example, Barbie the doll was kicked out of Iran about 2 years ago. Barbie had infiltrated Iranian toy stores through the connectivity of global retail. She began appearing on shelves. The mullahs called her Trojan horse of Western influence. They created Sarah, moon-faced doll, covered head to toe in black cloth, put her next to Barbie on the shelf. Sarah did not sell like hotcakes. So Barbie got sort of a fatwa issued against her. Detain Barbie wherever you see her was the order. Barbie became, for all practical purposes, a doll on the run. You laugh. Saudi Arabia did the same thing the next year. A country or region is functioning if it seeks to harmonize its internal rule set with the emerging global rule set: transparency, free markets, free trade, collective security. We forget we have fought a number of civil wars, one big violent one, over the rule sets that we've clashed over in this country. We're fighting a rule set clash right now on gay marriages. And every time we have one of these rule set clashes, we come back to the reality that we are 50 member states. And Massachusetts can do what it damn well pleases. We are seeing our civil wars replicated throughout the planet. People say, I can't understand these crazy people. All we need to do is to look into ourselves and into our past, and we will recognize every conflict we find around the world. Every single one. Including all the ones with religious overtones. We'll say the global rule set's always evolving. It's not just Davos man's interpretation. It's not just Seattle man's interpretation. Increasingly, it's Osama man's interpretation. We don't want your globalization, and we'll kill you to keep it out. Direction is critical, not degree. China's still ruled by a Communist Party, whose ideological mix is about 30% Marxist-Leninist, about 70% the Sopranos. More important to me, China joins the WTO, World Trade Organization. Imports rule sets it cannot create indigenously. China just let a foreign company take control of a Chinese bank this week. Why? WTO rule sets demanded it. That's a rule set change, a very profound one. Where will you find it? Wall Street Journal. So if you don't read the Wall Street Journal right now, you can't figure out security, I would argue. And I'm not just saying that because they put me on the front page. Not that I wouldn't mind being back on the front page. I'll say a country or region, it may be functioning, doesn't mean bad things can't happen to it, doesn't repeal the business cycle by a stretch. You can always fall off the map. That's the concern we have with an Argentina or Brazil or in India when you see a shift in the election. Functioning parts of the world, North America, Europe, both old and new, Russia under Putin's managed democracy, India in a pockmarked sense, China in a coastal sense, industrialized Asia, South Africa, the country, ABCs in South America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Put a circle around that, I'll call it the functioning core of globalization. Roughly 4 billion out of 6.3, 2/3 of the world's population. So when people try to sell me on the notion that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and it's perpetual war, and it's global chaos, and it's an American empire, and it's a global cop role for us, I say nonsense. 2/3 of the world functions just fine without our military interventions. Has done so for roughly a decade and a half. Just fine. No major incidences of mass violence anywhere in the core. Let me show you the other part. Here's the natural demand pattern that emerges for U.S. security exports since the end of the Cold War. U.S. crisis response since 1990. Almost 150 separate interventions, not including straightforward humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So some danger of guns going off. This is the pattern. Now, simple political scientist that I am, I drew a line around it. And I said, what is it about these regions that continue to draw our attention? Understanding this is a fairly simplistic approach. I'm trapping some very globalized societies in there, like a Singapore, like an Israel. And I briefed the Israelis and I briefed the Singaporeans, and they say, we have no problem with your description of the world. We know exactly what neighborhood we live in. This is why we enjoy having you as a big security partner. Singapore says, you want to park that carrier? Bring it right here. Pier not long enough? Let's add 50 yards. And I understand that I'm leaving the Cold War's tailbone, North Korea, up there, in an otherwise stable Northeast Asia. And why he matters, I would argue, is his takedown should create the basis for an East Asia NATO and the beginnings of a strategic partnership between us and China. So he still has a function to serve. I'm going to call this the non-integrating gap. It's globalization's ozone hole. This is bald spot. If you're fighting against globalization, the content flows. You don't want it in your neck of the woods because it's so challenging to your traditional society, because it empowers women disproportionately to men. Or if you can't win at globalization, you're too poor, you don't have the legal rule sets to attract the foreign direct investment that's been integrating China for the last 20 years. People say China's got the ability to build up its military. I say as long as it gets $50 billion a year in foreign direct investment from the outside world, it does. There's just no such thing as unilateral development anymore. Not for the United States, not for anybody. War within the context of everything else. Meanwhile, when George Bush asks, are you with us or against us? On September 12, 2001, we're surprised by who is with us. You know what? It's not really a choice so much as an understanding of where they are in history and where they want to go. You know, one of the problems the Bush administration has faced ever since 9/11 is they keep enunciating security policies that seem like reversals of long-held, cherished ideals that got us through the Cold War successfully, like preemption. My mom called me up after that speech President Bush gave. She said, in effect, don't those idiots in the White House realize what they're doing? They're going to ruin mutual assured destruction. Are we supposed to attack China tomorrow? I said, settle down, Mom. I'm the futurist in the family. Nothing changes with mutual assured destruction across the core. Nothing changes in terms of deterrence. Isn't it amazing that we no longer talk about strategic arms limitations talks with anybody across this core? Nobody. That was the dominant security agenda for about 25 years. I thought my whole career was going to be arms talks. Nobody talks about it anymore. Nobody. Nobody even notices that we don't even talk about it anymore. When we're talking preemption, we're talking inside the gap. My best evidence? International Criminal Court has this article. I think it's Article 98. It's an exclusionary article, which says, in effect, You can be exempted from being sued by another country if you choose to invade that country and engage in acts that could be considered worth suing over. In effect, it's an interventionary prenup. We have created treaties to take advantage of that exemption under the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We have signed about 70 of them at last count. 68 of them are inside the gap. So it's no secret about where we're going in this global war on terrorism. And it's no secret about where we're not going. Increasingly, we're seeing the definition of a scheme of deterrence or suppression for bad things coming out of the gap into the core. Three biggies: pandemics, terrorism, and illegal narcotics. So it's not just one rule set for the United States and another for the rest of the world. It's understanding that globalization is not a binary outcome. It's not nowhere or everywhere. It's a what and a where. Show me where globalization is, I'll show you connectivity. I'll show you rule sets. I'll show you no mass violence. Show me where globalization isn't. I'll show you much less connectivity, far fewer rule sets, and basically all the wars, all the civil wars, all the ethnic cleansing, all the genocide, all the employment of mass rape as a tool of terror, all the situations where children are forced into combat units. I'll show you the vast majority of the drug producers, the vast majority of the transnational terrorist groups that we care about. All inside the red. No mystery. So it's not when unilateralism makes sense, it's where. The core is still the world of multilateralism. We're a strange sort of empire. We go around and ask everybody in the world, could we pretty please invade Iraq before we did it? Which is not how empires throughout history have been run. Don't remember with Joe Stalin, Adolf Hitler, the Romans. Don't remember anybody doing it like that. We have seen a huge uptick in bilateral security assistance to what I call the seam states that ring this gap. So we have big interest in South African banking networks that we fear Al-Qaeda is accessing as sort of a back door. We are concerned about the ability of people to move in and out of Thailand's northern forests. We're concerned about this juncture of terrorism and narcotics and rebels. And so we're making big efforts. You track U.S. bilateral security assistance since 9/11, you will find it all ringing that gap very explicitly. When we engage in unilateralism inside the gap, frankly, it's a form of functional unilateralism. We're the only military in the world that can send massive amounts of power at great distances and actually use it. I think it was last year, China sent 800 peacekeepers to Central Africa. And within about 3 weeks, they were bitching about the logistics. 800 guys, their guns in their pup tents, and they were straining at the leash. We send something like 250,000 troops to the Middle East and all the stuff that goes with them to wage war. Nobody else comes even close to that. So we can ask the UN to bless us with a resolution and dress us with coalition partners that, frankly, we don't need for the warfighting part, but we find very handy for the peacekeeping part. But the major employment of warfighting assets around the world is going to be done by the United States in a functionally unilateral role. It's not the U.S. flaunting the rules, but stepping up to the unique tasks of not global cop, but a policeman, frankly, that walks the beat 24/7 inside the gap. And there are different rule sets between those two arenas. It's a lot like talking to a cop in Los Angeles. You say, do you behave the same way in Brentwood as you do South Central? And he says no, and you ask why, and he says, because I want to get home for dinner in one piece. And the rule sets aren't the same in South Central as they are in Brentwood. If you expect me to go there, you're going to have to understand that. And frankly, we have to understand that, and our European allies have to understand that when we go inside the gap and do these kinds of things. I'd like to emphasize this is a very boundable problem, but it's a very big problem in terms of geography. Here's my favorite map. It's called the Peters projection. It's favored by the UN. And no, I'm not talking about Ralph Peters, because that map would have war everywhere. What's so great about the Peters projection is that everything lines up north to south, east to west, which makes it really easy to figure things out. Another thing that's cool, and why it looks so distorted, frankly, to the normal eye, is that it's geographically accurate. Here's the secret of cartography. If you've ever looked at the Defense Department map, you're misguided. Greenland is actually much smaller than Africa. They're not actually the same size. Here's what my gap looks like on this map. It's big. Now, one of the first things we noticed, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we closed 150 bases, major bases, 1,000 people or more across the core. 24 and counting new ones inside the gap. So Andy Hone, Office Secretary of Defense, his big plan for moving bases around the world, frankly, all it involves is moving them closer to the gap. That's all it involves. This is your expeditionary theater for the 21st century. It's not going away. You can vote Bush Cheney out of office. It'll still be there. So president after president, administration after administration, Republican and Democrat, are going to have to deal with this. And one of the first things we discover in this global war on terrorism, we got a lot of different cooks working this broth. Southern Command, European Command, Central Command, Pacific Command. Basically precinct captains. And what is logically described as largely an undercover war. So one of the first things that Secretary Rumsfeld did in this global war on terrorism, very indicative, I would argue, of his approach to transformation. Instead of going directly at existing institutions and say, change, he designates a cannibalizing agent and says, go be more like them. And that cannibalizing agent, where the warfighting ethos of the U.S. military is going to migrate, and has been migrating for quite some time, is Special Operations Command. That's why they were given operational control of the global war on terrorism. And we're seeing a redefinition of Strategic Command as a global strike force, the beginnings of a matrix organization. Warfighting is going to migrate in the direction of these two commands, previously considered just supporting. Now leads in their own right, in distinct contrast to the so-called pro-councils of the combatant commanders of the world. Some of the implications we draw from this map. First, we emphasize the advantages of exterior position. All the good stuff's on the outside, no matter how you measure it. Fiber optic cable, money, R&D, population, wealth, trade. It's all better on the outside. It's a very boundable problem. We talk about the need for more sensors because we've got to reduce unambiguous warning. Why? We want to be about prevention, not just retaliation. We have not caught up to that yet. Frankly, that's what generated Secretary Rumsfeld's snowflake they published on the front page of USA Today, asking for metrics. Very honest question, which of course brings upon him immediate ridicule and speculations that he's leaving office. Because Americans don't like to think strategically. Already, the historians and the grand strategists and the empire thinkers, who if they thought about it for 10 seconds, and if they remembered what they wrote prior to the invasion, would understand we weren't going to deal or transform a Middle East in a matter of 12 months. All these guys are already declaring this an absolute failure after 12 months. That's the level of grand strategy we have in this country. We got historians declaring the grand march of history over in 12 months. A premium on forward deterrence and strike. We got to stay out there. We have to avoid what we've been doing for the last 15 years, which is sucking the troops back home. So are the boys coming home? No, they're never coming home. No exit strategy. We need to get more rugged, urban, because to be seen in this war is to be killed, so people are going to hide increasingly. Good example, Reason, Libertarian magazine, June issue, sent out to all 40,000 subscribers. On the cover of each issue, overhead satellite photo of the neighborhood of the subscriber with their house circled. And the title on the front of the magazine is, "We Know Where You Live, John Smith." That's connectivity in the core. in its most amazing format. The opposite of that, we can't find bin Laden in northwest Pakistan because he's living in a hole in the ground. We've got to get more soft-like, special operations forces. If it's a war against super-empowered individuals, everybody we put on the ground or in the air or on the sea has to be super-empowered, which gives interesting possibilities for small nations in terms of coalitions. We shift from big bases to smaller bases. That's Andy Hohn's work in Office Secretary of Defense. And here's the part that I think the retired flags on Fox didn't get during the last war in Iraq. We've spent a lot of money on strategic speed across the 90s. I think it's the wrong way to think about speed because I don't think we ever go to war quickly. I differentiate between tactical speed. That's an obvious good. Gets our servicemen and women home at the end of the day alive in one piece. Differentiate from that and operational speed, which I like to call net-centric warfare's Wayne Gretzky speed. Wayne Gretzky's the greatest hockey player in the history of NHL. He was asked, why are you so good? You're not the fastest skater. He said, I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck will be. That's common operational picture. That's speed of command. That's synchronicity. That's moving bytes more than bullets. Last point, strategic tempo should never be about speed with this country. Nobody likes a rash hyperpower. We never engage in war quickly. Never. Iraq invades Kuwait. We respond rapidly, reinvading Kuwait about 8 months later. Why? Because we're a democracy. We debate war like crazy, before, during, and after. And that's not going to change. Nobody wants us to engage in war quickly. Instead, our strategic tempo should highlight inevitability. It's the ultimate psyop. We told Saddam, cut it out. No, really, cut it out. We're coming in about 6 months. We're coming in 4 months, 2 months. We're coming next week. We're coming Tuesday morning. And when we got there, he didn't want to fight. They were all gone. Why? Because nobody wants to fight the U.S. military. We can't find anybody even willing to fly planes against us anymore. That's the disparity between us and them in actual war. Very different disparity in the peacekeeping, as we discover. But this is existential dissuasion. It tells the world, if you really want to break rules, if you really want to be a rogue nation, this is what you're going to get. And we can do it with ease. What we have not demonstrated is that we can do the back half work. Here's my mantra. Disconnectedness defines danger. It has to change the way we think about intelligence. The intelligence community, frankly, it's like the drunk looking for his car keys under the street lamp even though his car is parked 2 blocks away because the light is better over here. We don't know anything about the gap. We don't have the intelligence networks for it. It's absolutely embarrassing. That's why we get such amazing calls wrong, like, did Libya get far in its WMD? How far was Iraq? What do we really know about North Korea? Almost nothing. That has to change. Increasingly, we have to reorient not just the intelligence community, but the way we think about war to the gap. Does it mean we never hedge against China in the future? Absolutely not. Does it mean the vast bulk of our resources and imagination should be focused on what I would describe as the absolute failure of U.S. national security 25 years from now at $450 billion a year? No. I think we have to spend money to create success every year between now and 2025. And I think we can do that and maintain a certain hedge against China invading Taiwan. A new definition of crisis to go with this new map of the world. I'm going to explain what I mean by this new definition of crisis by telling you how I was educated as a young political military analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses at the end of the Cold War. I'm going to differentiate between what I call vertical and horizontal scenarios. When I came to CNA, I was taught to think about surprise, strategic surprise, as strictly a vertical scenario. Definition of change and real danger, a vertical scenario. What do I mean by this classic Cold War definition of a vertical scenario? It unfolds with lightning speed. It's always a bolt from the blue. The opponents, conveniently, were known beforehand in the Cold War. So were our allies. Strategy and battle plans published in thick volumes up on the shelves. We practiced them day and night. Tom Clancy made a fortune writing about them. Single-handed poker, no evolutions or change. You couldn't be Poland in the middle of World War III, stand up and say, you know what, I'd like to reconsider. Static time frame. You're going to fight the war. The world remains frozen in place. Not a lot of good global economic histories of the Second World War. Why? Because there was none. It was a global war. Everything froze in place. And then you figured out who the losers were on the far end, and you took away their stuff. This is a highly idealized definition of World War I and World War II. World War I, fight it out in Europe, take away the losers' empires. World War II, draw a line through Europe. Soviets get half, we get half. World War III, delayed gratification. Wall comes down, we go into Russia, loot it for everything we can. Classics of this genre. The Fulda Gap, which never happened, and the mini-me version, the DMZ, which we still have. Now, my problem with this education was I never actually experienced it across my career, this definition of crisis. Instead, I experienced cognitive dissonance. I kept looking at the world, trying to make my mental models fit it. What we saw across the post-Cold War era, something very different. Eventually, I came to dub it the post-Cold War horizontal scenario. This thing that goes up and down and forever and ever. My definitions of this. No clear beginning or end. Drags on forever. Can anybody name the year the Balkans crisis began? I think it was 1390. Definition of the enemy changes over time. We go into Somalia. At first it was famine. Then it was lack of governance. Then it was warlords. Then it was that one warlord. Then we get a bunch of guys killed and we decide it's really the UN that's the problem. So we got the hell out of Dodge. Allies come and go, not just the French. Coalitions, it's almost like festival seating. Strategy evolves. Strikes, not battles. Definition of the problem depends on what op-ed you're reading that morning. In fact, on a good morning, you can find 2 or 3 on the same page. World goes on. Meanwhile, you're babysitting some crappy situation, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. 2 classics of this genre. Fighting Monty Python's Black Knight, Milosevic. Lopping off limbs of his body politic as he idiotically taunts us and dares us to fight on. He sits limbless in the docket, spitting at us still. His trial goes on for another year or so. And then keeping Saddam in the box for about 12 years. What did you get with that? You made the Europeans a little happier? You kept oil stable coming out of the Middle East. You let globalization in the go-go 90s go. Because you went there. No circle for this. Between AIDS and all the deaths from conflict, roughly a Holocaust here. Roughly a Holocaust. Roughly 6-7 million. Doesn't appear on anybody's maps. Certainly not on the Pentagon's maps. Page 23, New York Times. Nobody cares because nothing comes out of there that we fear enough or value enough to make the effort on. I put these 2 together and I describe what I call a system perturbation, a shock to the system that alters rule sets. I'm going to talk about pain. I'm going to talk about time, sort of the meaning of life. I'm going to say a system perturbation begins with a vertical shock followed by any number of horizontal tails. I'll throw up 4 here illustratively. Vertical shock, obvious, 9/11. Some of the horizontal tails. What happened to the airline industries? What happened to the financial sector? The anthrax scare, fellow traveler or not, I don't care. Pathway dependency. And the immediate horizontal tail called Afghanistan. Some of the tails that come off the original tails. What happens to the airline industry happens to the tourism industry all over the world. Damages dramatically the Egyptian economy within weeks. Damages the Israeli economy. By extension, the West Bank economy. Because at that point, a lot of day labor is coming across the line, backfilling service economy jobs. So violence goes up in the Middle East. Part of bin Laden's plan? Absolutely. What happens in financial sectors Happens to the insurance industry, happens to the reinsurance industry, if you follow that interesting tale. Spills over into the airline insurance industry. And so you see the merging of these horizontal scenarios. With anthrax, we get this interesting tale called the breakthrough on AIDS drugs patent relief around the world. Helps launch the Doha development round. Part of bin Laden's secret plan? I don't think so. Making AIDS drugs cheaper across sub-Saharan Africa. And yet it's an interesting line. 9/11 happens. Anthrax guy or gal strikes. 5 dead, 13 sick in the United States. At that point, Canada, normally a wonderful rule set follower, tells Bayer, the German giant pharmaceutical, we're going to break your patent on Cipro. We're going to crank it generically here in Canada. You're not going to get a dime. We're going to call it a national emergency. Charles Schumer, U.S. Senator from New York, says we should do the same thing. Bush administration kind of whispers across the Atlantic. We don't think we need to do that at this time. Bayer catches the hint. Turns on every factory it has in the world 24/7, cranks out Cipro at an unprecedented rate, floods the market, cut rate costs. At that point, figuratively in the back of the room, sub-Saharan African nations raise their hands and they say, how do you people do that with a straight face? We've been asking for AIDS drugs patent relief because millions are dying across sub-Saharan Africa. You say, boy, it's complex. Shareholders' expectations, R&D, patent copyright. Wish I could help. You get 5 dead, 13 sick. You rewrite the rules one afternoon. Sub-Saharan African nations threaten to derail the launching of the Doha development round, being held in Qatar, November 2001. They hoped to launch the development round in Seattle, 1999, but Seattle man took care of that. So the powers that be were very intent on showing the world that bin Laden does not derail the WTO. Sub-Saharan African nations are going to derail it on the basis of their anger over the intransigence of the old core on AIDS drugs patent relief. Bob Zellick, U.S. Trade Representative, steps to the fore, cuts the deal, Doha development round is launched. A lot of back and forth since then. But one of the upsides of this whole strain is you're going to have cheaper AIDS drugs throughout the gap. And it's interesting. Soon after that gets announced, China says, you know what? We have a very serious AIDS problem. And decides they're going to start breaking patents all throughout China on creating AIDS cocktail drugs. Absolutely amazing story, which talks about the unintended consequences. With Afghanistan, you have the new tale called Pakistan. Pakistan, frankly, was on its way to being declared a rogue nation. We were just waiting for the paperwork to come through the system. Now they're our friends all over again. Great. India and Pakistan almost go to a war after the 12/13 bombing of the New Delhi Parliament, which occurs in the aftermath of our takedown of Afghanistan, which changes dramatically our relationship with Pakistan and also pluses up our military-to-military cooperation with India. And what was so scary about the massing of the troops on that border after that terrorist attack was both sides were saying to the other side, you're in a world of trouble, my friend, because I got a brand new friend called the United States. You want to talk about a scary situation? The rule set reset on nuclear war in South Asia would have been profound. And then we have the tale called Dustans. We got military bases in the former Soviet Union. If I came to you in 1985 and said in 2004 there'd be military bases throughout Central Asia, you'd say, how many millions died in World War III? Now over time, some of these tales disappear and new ones appear. The global war on terrorism is a tale that we create. Within months of 9/11, it looked like we were going to pull the string on Israel and the Palestinian Authority because of the high jump and suicide bombings that were occurring there. You could argue the Bush administration redirected and said, no, 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 we're going to do this one instead. And as we ran up to the war last spring, our friend on the Korean Peninsula said, hey, don't forget about me. I'm still crazy. What's a guy got to do to get an arms inspection? Whoops, there goes another one. I have no idea what's in the nose. Now, when you show this kind of slide to complexity theorists, first thing they ask you is, how do you do all the animation? Because that can't be PowerPoint. And I say, for a consulting fee, I'll tell you. The other thing they'll tell you is, don't kid yourself. A lot of green lines went into this. This is 20 years payback for Afghanistan. It's 50 years payback for the creation of the State of Israel. It's 800 years payback for King Arthur and the Crusades. It's like your marriage. No bad deed ever goes forgotten. The other thing they'll tell you is, you get that much stress in the system, something's got to pop. This is a super saturated solution at that point. And what popped was, we decided to create a vertical shock ourselves. Operation Iraqi Freedom. What happens, in effect, when the perturbed chooses to become the perturber? That's when it gets scary and exciting all at once, I would argue. What's neat about this is you get to set the timing of the creation of the new rule sets. Bin Laden picked 9/11, the date. Based on our fascination with shark attacks across the summer, I would say we probably weren't ready for it. We picked last March. We scheduled it in advance. We let the networks know about it. We priced it beforehand. We let the contracts. We put it right after March Madness. Worked just fine. You get to set the conditions under which the new rules emerge. You fight the war for a demonstration effect. There's a reason why interstate war disappeared across the 1990s. One of the reasons why is we took Kuwait back from Iraq. We basically said to the system, you think you're going to conquer in that old-fashioned way, it's not going to happen. And lo and behold, interstate war seems to disappear across the 90s. Last good interstate war, Ethiopia, Eritrea. Page 29, New York Times, exactly where it belongs. You establish the target audience for the rule set export. You define an axis of evil and you say, listen up, do you want some of this? And Libya decides to change its colors. You grab hold of the microphone, but you force them to hold the press conferences. You force the leadership of the Middle East to explain why there are so many authoritarian governments there. Frankly, the bombs that have gone off since 9/11 inside the Middle East. And the warfare that's engaged since 9/11 inside the Middle East. Transnational terrorism is like politics. It's inherently local. So you have a choice in dealing with terrorism vectoring in towards this country. You can try to firewall yourselves off from it. Don't think it'll work. Think you'll damage our society in the process. You can run around and try to kill these guys as quickly as possible. But as we've seen with Israel, in the West Bank and Gaza, you tend to create more than you can kill in that process. Or third, you can decide what their strategic goals are, and you can try to get there first. There is no secret about what Osama bin Laden's goal is for the Middle East. He wants to drive the West out of the Middle East so he can hijack the Middle East out of the world. We've seen it before. It's the same basic deal that Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks pulled off. An exclusionary rule set for a big chunk of humanity. Lenin eventually grabbed 1/3 of humanity thanks to Mao and others. And we're just seeing a modern variant of it. And he's fairly explicit with it. Osama says to the Europeans, you leave the Middle East, I'll stop killing you. You got 90 days. What the Bush administration is really trying to do, and they're quite explicit about it, is create a big bang in the Middle East. They hope to change Syria's behavior. By extension, to create a better situation in Lebanon. By extension, better situation with Palestine. By extension, relief for Israel. They hope to create the process of change in Iran. They hope to alleviate some of the stresses for Saudi Arabia, so we move our troops out. But they're still hoping for positive evolutions there. So a lot of expectations. Of course, our friend Kim Jong-il, he can always throw a hex on this party anytime he wants, pull us right over to Northeast Asia in a heartbeat. And that's the fear. But what's so thrilling and dangerous about what we just tried to pull off and what we're still trying to pull off? And no, I don't think you can judge it completely in 12 months. But I think that's ridiculous. This big bang is basically the pursuit of a system perturbation. What Osama bin Laden tried to achieve on 9/11 was to throw our rule sets in such tremendous flux with that attack that we would retreat militarily, economically, and politically from the Middle East. He wants to disconnect the world from the Middle East. So if we want to deny that entity's strategic goal, we have to connect the Middle East faster than he can disconnect it. And that's very difficult. A way of thinking about the scenarios. In the Middle East, what happens with Iraq? Do we get the makeover? Or does it become our West Bank? The effect on the rest of the region. Does it become a chosen trauma for Muslims worldwide? Or do you get the hoped-for Big Bang? Worst case, West Bank, chosen trauma. Black Hawk Down, the series. Not just a bad movie, a reality series we watch every week. To numbing and or enraging effect. Why? Because we got the reserve component over there big time now. The Abrams Doctrine, when we put it together back in the early 1970s, said you can't go to war unless you use the reserve component. We've gotten around that rule. We can go to war whenever we want without using the reserve component. What we can't do is wage the peace without them. And we're going to discover that increasingly as this occupation drags on. The danger here is this becomes a global magnet. Next worst case situation. The Arab Yugoslavia. Sequential instabilities around the dial. That's probably the pathway you take if you accept the notion you're going to have 3 Iraqs at the end of this process. The Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites. The better route, I think, what I call the new Berlin Wall. Muslims are still angry about our situation and our presence. We succeed somewhat in Iraq. We focus on the next problem set, Israel and the Palestinian Authority. We sit on that security fence probably for 2 or 3 decades. You say it can't be done. I say we did it in Berlin. We're still doing it in Korea. Europeans have done it for decades in Cyprus. We know how to sit on walls. Israel will be just fine without the West Bank. The West Bank is going to need a lot of aid. But I'll ask you, which is cheaper over the long run? Best case, makeover, you get the Big Bang. Call that scenario Persia engulfed. I would argue the counter-revolution is waiting for a Chernobyl-like spark in Iran. Won't take a whole heck of a lot. I think we're within several years of that happening. I don't expect the mullahs to rule that country in the same way they do now, 2010. And I think Saudi Arabia sees the writing on the wall and will move progressively in that direction. Why? Because the terrorists are coming back home and blowing up things in Saudi Arabia now. So system perturbation. This is a slide I developed for the National Intelligence Council because John Landry there said, can't you just give me a slide with words on it? A system perturbation is an international security order thrown into a state of some confusion by a perversely shocking development. Emphasize perverse. 9/11 was the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. First opportunity in my life to watch several dozen people I knew die live on national television. I was meant to watch that. I was meant to be impressed. Same thing with Nick Berg. It is designed to get an emotional response. But we have to understand, when Marines walk unopposed in Baghdad last April, at the end of that conflict, before the occupation set in, that turned the world upside down throughout the Arab world. That was a perversely shocking development. The notion that Saddam would drop like that. This vertical shock generates an outflow of horizontal waves. The cascading effects can cross sectoral boundaries. Think about the SARS super spreaders. One guy gets on a plane in Hong Kong, flies to Toronto. Toronto gets shut down by the World Health Organization. Absolutely amazing. In this outflow process, seemingly every rule set is somehow disturbed, altered. We got a preemption strategy. That's a huge change. The fluxing of the system is temporary, but it's path dependent. We will never, thanks to 9/11 plus anthrax, not have a Department of Homeland Security. You take away 9/11, anthrax scare would have been nothing. Would have been a Columbine. Would have been a Michael Moore movie. You put it in the aftermath of 9/11, you change history. So whoever that individual was wielded an enormous amount of power, I would argue. The potential for conflict, clash of cultures, doesn't have to be always violent. Europe and the U.S. over Iraq. We see a war, they see a police action in the global war on terrorism. China and the World Health Organization on the SARS. Very interesting rule set clash. WHO basically said to China, you want to be connected to the global economy? You better clean up your medical act now, or we'll stop travel into your country. Just like that. End states, some new rules, like the Patriot Act, some old rules, like the UN Security Council, and a mixing of old and new. Russia joins NATO, Russia's still a problem. A new ordering principle. Take that map, take that definition of crisis, talk about how we're going to change DOD. I will make an argument about an ordering principle. I will say it's a core conflict model around which everything is planned, procured, organized, trained, operated, how you become a flag. Most importantly, how you become a flag. You change career paths, you change the military in about 8 to 10 years. Frankly, I would like to see all flags become totally purple. All admirals and generals, once they reach flag rank, lose all service identity. Because as soon as that happens, I can really start smashing some rice bowls. And in 10 years, I'll have a dramatically different military because everybody who wants to become a flag will understand that's the price. Not just jointness, way beyond jointness. I will argue we've had an ordering principle since we created DOD, Defense Department, back in 1947. And that ordering principle, I'll describe it as great power war. We assume we're going to fight somebody very big, high level of technology just like ours. It's going to be an all-out declared war. It's an industrial era mobilization model, which I don't think anymore fits the circumstances we face. So I will argue for a larger definition, and I will call that definition system perturbations. You will say we have new definitions of warfare. It's called a revolution in military affairs. It's called fourth generation warfare. It's called net-centric warfare. I will tell you those are all definitions of war within the context of war. When we have to think about war within the context of everything else, like who pays for the war, who shows up for the peace. How did we get to this point? Three-tiered perspective. I'm going to talk about the system as a whole, nation states, individuals living within nation states. In the Cold War, we had a system-level definition of conflict and threat. It was called Great Power War, World War III between us and the Soviets. Because we could never fight them in that kind of war, too dangerous. On the level of nation states, we only engaged in proxy wars. Our side fought their side, and their side fought our side. Sometimes we'd get bored and we'd switch sides, like with Ethiopia and Somalia. You take them for a while. Down here, we had the so-called lesser includeds, which we preferred to leave to law enforcement. This is what we organized around. Even though 95% of our business was this, we sub-optimized for that because that was the whole enchilada. Since we got through the Cold War without global nuclear Armageddon, I'll say, good choice. We get to the 1990s. The Soviets don't come along. We downshift. We say, two major theater wars is almost like a great power war. Do you think we could sell Congress on that? And we did. It was called Les Aspin's Bottom-Up Review. I know, because when I brief Congress, they say, yeah, that's it. That's what you sold us. Down here, everybody got a promotion. I'm not just a terrorist. I'm a transnational actor. Up here, we didn't have anything, so we made something up. A threat to be determined. China, all grown up. But this is what we sold Congress. This is what we organized around. An abstract force-sizing principle. We come to today. What should we organize around? Some people say, for $450 billion, you better do better than just whacking the Taliban 6 weeks later. How about protecting Americans? How about taking $200 billion out of defense and putting it in the Department of Homeland Security? Now. What the military fears about that kind of argument is that they will be dragged down into the muck. They will be ruined as a military. You'll ruin this military that we spent 25 years putting together since the end of Vietnam. You'll destroy it. You'll turn us into a giant police force. I say relax. We got a department for that. Third biggest one. Some people say, we've just invaded Sicily. Let's figure out who Italy is. It's World War IV. Hell, I say let's just kill all their leaders and Christianize them. For a minute, I think I was channeling Ann Coulter there. Well, it was good to be that thin. Since she breathes fire and I breathe air, I'll say that's simple fear-mongering. You can't tell the world your grand strategy is, let's roll, bring it on. Who's next? You talking to me? Because I'm the only military superpower here. What is left unsaid by this administration encourages a lot of bonehead ideas and a lot of fear-mongering by people who frankly should be shouted off the stage. We're a system-level power. We need a system-level definition of instability and insecurity. This is what we should organize around. The rest of the world will fall in place if we can manage this. You know what? That's a whole lot more than DOD. It's a whole lot more than the Pentagon planning for war. It's way beyond interagency. What we face is a problem of success, not failure. This is the deeper reach of U.S. military power over time. I got into this business 15 years ago to do strategic nuclear planning against the Soviets. It was a war against a bloc. By the middle of my career, I was working on regional hegemons, wars against bad regimes. Now we fight warfare against individuals. We went into Panama, we wanted Noriega. We went into Somalia, we figured out it was Aidid and his clan. We went into the Balkans, we figured out just get Milosevic and his people. We went into Iraq looking for a deck of cards. We're just here for the bad guys. Please go about your business. We don't fight militaries anymore. We don't fight nation states. And to call it interstate war when the U.S. comes in as a leader of a coalition to take down a few bad actors is such an abuse of the phrase. When I got into this business, the standard was an 8 to 9 minute response to Soviet nuclear launching of attack. Within a couple of years, our standard is going to be a UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, operating on the far side of the earth. It's going to find, recognize, and kill one person in 8 to 9 minutes. That is an amazing evolution in my 15-year career. How much will our military forces change to mirror this environment? I'll tell you, our legacy, in terms of capability spread, looks something like this. We're primarily built to fight other nation states, so the bulk of our capabilities are found there. We have a certain strategic capacity and the ability to go inside nation states and deal with individuals, civil affairs, special ops. I will tell you, the Revolution in Military Affairs crowd and this administration, when they came in, this OSD, this Office of Secretary of Defense, their dream of transformation was a very pristine military that was going to be largely a system-level function, a certain capacity to defeat nation states. Never were going to do any of this stuff. Never go inside nation states, never nation build, none of that stuff. Condi Rice, National Security Advisor, said no special operations personnel are ever going to escort kids to kindergarten on my watch. Words she has subsequently had to eat, because the global war on terrorism adds back this part big time. You're going to deal with global terrorism. You're going to get inside nations. Otherwise, you field a first-half team in a league that insists on keeping score until the end of the game. So we can run up the score by halftime and then get our asses kicked the rest of the time, unless we rethink the scene between war and peace. This force gets you with the Iraq War. Brilliant. This force gets you the trouble we have now. This force. That was Rumsfeld's argument. Great argument. That was Shinseki's argument, Chief of Army Staff. Great argument. Problem is, we called both definitions how to fight this war. And the answer was they were two definitions for two different things. One was to fight the war, and one was to wage the peace. And until we separate those concepts, we're not going to understand that we're basically going to move from this diamond shape to this hourglass, and it's going to be hard. What I think has to be done. Here's my favorite bonehead definition of the future of war from the 1990s. Asymmetrical, area denial, anti-access strategies, which is the Pentagon's way of saying, we're really huge. Anybody we're going to fight is going to be much smaller. They won't fight us in a straight-up fashion. But we can't say that because people would understand that. So we call it area denial, anti-access, asymmetrical challenges. Why? Because it's got a lot of A's in it, apparently. Here's the definition. You got a battle space. You got an enemy embedded within that battle space. The United States is going to try to access that battle space. They're going to throw up area denial, anti-access, asymmetrical strategies. Banana peel on the tarmac. They're going to slip computer viruses in our networks. All our Achilles heels will be exposed. This is largely a geographic definition. It focuses almost exclusively on the start of conflict. Frankly, we're a first quarter team. We're like Bill Walsh and the San Francisco 49ers in the 1980s. We have our first 20 scripted plays. We're just brilliant. Problem is, we don't adapt well after that. And it's because of the way we think about war. I will argue there is no battle space we can't access. They told us we couldn't do Afghanistan, we did it. They told us we couldn't do Iraq. There'd be tens of thousands of deaths. Not a problem. 150 lost. What we have trouble accessing over time is the transition space that follows. This huge territory between the end of war and the start of real peace. What we have trouble accessing are the outcomes that we seek to create. Very different asymmetrical, anti-access, area denial strategies. This is not overwhelming force, but proportional force. It's not firing live bullets into a crowd of angry women and children in Baghdad. Why? Because the minute you do that, the International Red Cross says to you, if you're going to behave like that in public, I can't be seen with you people anymore. And you lose access to the International Red Cross, and your credibility takes a dive. This is not about projecting power, but it's about staying power. What you lose access to are partners. 17,000 peacekeepers we did not get from India. In this struggle, the assumption is the West is weak and flaccid. So this is a Western struggle against an Islamic world. That's how they like to paint it. Imagine what a different occupation it is if we have 15, 20,000 Russians, 15, 20,000 Chinese, 15, 20,000 Indians. You say, you never get the Chinese. Whose energy is going to double? Whose energy requirement is going to double the next 20 years? And where are they going to get it? Whose blood? Whose oil? But we're not making those deals because we're not thinking strategically. And so we are going to declare something that we can't access, frankly, in a real fashion. We're going to declare a political handoff on 30 June, fundamentally for presidential election reasons. And that's too bad. We have to understand that we're going to fight different people across these spaces. Until we create a force for these back half situations, we are not going to score any real victories in this global war on terrorism. What we really need, and what this reflects, is the lack of an A to Z system for dealing with politically bankrupt states. What do I mean by that? An A to Z system, meaning you take a country into A, they come out on Z. What's a good example? The International Monetary Fund has a system, A to Z, for dealing with an economically bankrupt state. It's basically a sovereign Chapter 11. You go in at A, you come out at Z. We argue about this rule set incessantly. But it's basically there. What we have for dealing with politically bankrupt states. Think about front half, think about back half. We have the UN Security Council as a grand jury. I indict you, I indict you. I can't do anything about it, but I indict you. We have a Leviathan called the US military, which says in effect, you want me to take them down? I'll take them down. And on the far end, we have an international criminal court to try these guys. What we are missing is an executive function to take that indictment and do something with it. I think that's going to be found in a G7, G8, G20 over time, not in the UN Security Council. What we are missing is the US-enabled sysadmin force, as I like to call it. The back half force that attracts coalition partners, because we make clear we're going to wage peace as effectively as we wage war. And what we're missing is what Sebastian Mallaby describes as an international reconstruction fund, an IRF, like an IMF, to deal with the rehabilitation and reconstruction of any regime you decapitate. I will argue, though, if the US military doesn't create this system can't come into being. Because until we create this, we won't get the coalition partners. When I give this brief abroad to foreign militaries, they tend to jump at the sysadmin concept as opposed to the Leviathan concept, because they say, you know what? We can't even play with you in big war. We can't keep up. We can barely talk to you. But we can do the back half stuff. And a lot of GAP countries prefer to do this. Why? They get paid $1,100 per soldier per month by the UN. It's a moneymaker. But if we don't create this capability, this system cannot come into being. You'll say, you're asking too much of DOD. I say you created the internet and you changed the world. I'll say you created GPS and you changed the world. You created UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, and you have changed the world and are continuing to change the world. You create this force. You seed it. You prioritize it. You show me a 4-star military police officer, you'll change the world. This is why we need to change. I'm going to talk about the difference between reality and desire, which is always tricky inside the Beltway. I'm going to talk about the 1990s. Berlin Wall comes down. Desert Storm. A split emerges inside the U.S. military between those who see a future they can live with and those who see a future they cannot live with. Good example, U.S. submarine community. Looking for somebody to get nervous about. Office of Naval Intelligence will tell you right now, Chinese are looking 10 feet tall. Why? Because Osama bin Laden doesn't have submarines. Those who don't see a reality they can live with have moved towards desire over the 1990s. And they invented a special coded language to describe their journey. Problem is they need a big sexy opponent to fight against. And if they can't find one, they'll make one up. Whereas the rest of the military got pulled into the muck. And this muck was described with a very derisive term called military operations other than war. I ask you, who joins the military to do things other than war? Who becomes a 4-star admiral or general specializing in things other than war, other than Tony Zinni? This is Pentagon code for we don't want to do this. We spent the 90s working the messy scene between the globalizing parts of the world and the non-globalizing parts. Clinton administration wasn't interested in running DOD after the fiasco with gays in the military, yielding us two of the quietest secretaries of defense we've ever had. I don't even remember their names. But the second guy was really good looking, I remember that. So we were left home alone across the 1990s. What did we do? We bought one military and we operated another. It's like the guy who goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, it really hurts when I do this." Doctor says, "Stop doing that." I used to give this brief inside the Pentagon to the barons inside the Navy, the resource barons. And I'd come in, it was like 93, I came in and I said, "You're buying one Navy and you're operating another. And it's wrong. It's just plain wrong." And they'd say, "Dr. Barnett, you are so right. Can you come back next year and remind us again?" And I did, for several years in a row. The patient could not change the self-destructive behavior, even though the patient was aware of it. 9/11 heals the rift. It jerks the transformation gurus out of their long-term fantasization about China and says, you know what? Make it good for now. If you're going to transform this force, I got a reason for you now. You got a networked opponent. We need to free up resources because we're going to elevate this from crap to real grand strategy, because that's how you're going to shrink the gap. Some people put these two things together and they call it empire. Sell a lot of books that way. I think that's a load, personally. Empires are about the enforcement of not just minimal rule sets, but maximal rule sets. Not just what you can't do, but what you must do. It has never been the American system of governance to do that. It's not the way we interact with the outside world. Our function is fundamentally one of system administration. We only advocate certain minimal rule sets that must be followed in order to remain connected to the global network, the global economy. Now I'm going to give you a short break. Let's reconstitute 25 after. difficulties. Ready? Take you through definitions of war and conflict. Now we'll take you through some definitions of the system and how we seek to administer it, how we seek to understand waging war within the context of everything else. I'm going to give you a classic Royal Dutch shell methodology. 2 questions, 4 outcomes. What happens to globalization 4, as I define it, 2002 and counting? The first question, the what question. How do we define the nature of the struggle? Is it the best versus the rest, or the West versus the rest? Basic breakdown arguments. Tom Friedman, Lexus and the Olive Tree, up on top. Sam Huntington, Clash of Civilizations, down below. Tom Barnett, number 28 on Amazon. Pentagon's new map, up on top. Robert Kaplan, anything he's ever written, down below. Robert Kaplan went to West Africa and saw the future of the world. I said, it's West Africa. Then he went to Los Angeles, got even more scared, wrote another book. How this comes about. I talked about that rule set misalignment that develops across the 90s. Does that persist? Are we always chasing to catch up with technology and economics in terms of the political and security rule sets? Or do we actually normalize? We catch up. Everything's back in sync for some period of time. 4 possible outcomes. Worst case scenario, a division by culture. This character flaw in the system remains. Call that one globalization traumatized. Can you imagine? The old core turns on itself. Europeans are from Venus. Americans are from Mars. The gap only grows. Real Robert Kaplan territory. A division by culture, but new rules emerge. At least they're recognized by the old core. Japan, Europe, the United States. The danger is new cores arise. So when I see the group of 20 plus in the World Trade Organization negotiations as an intermediary between the old core of Europe and the United States and Japan and those negotiations with the gap, and I see that that group of 20 plus that staged the walkout at Cancun is India, Brazil, China, all the countries I define as the new core, I get worried about that. I get worried about the fact that we have absolutely no new core powers in the occupation force in Iraq now. Better outcomes, a division by competency, but we don't deal with this character flaw. This is the knee-jerk reaction. Let's put a fence around these crazy people and let them kill each other. We'll move on to hydrogen. What would Jesus drive? Problem is, gap strikes back on a regular basis in that phenomenon, in that scenario. You can't retreat from the world and expect the rest of the world to work out. They will export their pain and their anger in your direction on a regular basis. Best case outcome, a division by competency, new rules emerge. Call this one globalization normalized. The core, both old and new, master 9/11s, which they're going to keep trying until you demonstrate it will have no impact. It will not drive you out of the Middle East. And you shrink the gap progressively. Meaning you take down bad actors militarily, and the real integration comes to private sector. Government, tiny role. 4 elements I put together. I think I lost my sound. I'll confess, I'm an economic determinist. I'll say technology is the main driver of history. If globalization continues to advance, all these good things will happen. You can attach numbers to most of these. In terms of per capita income. Get them above a certain level and they stop doing a lot of these bad things, start moving in the direction of these positive things. But I'll argue we have to manage carefully 4 crucial flows within globalization 4. Those 4 crucial flows, meaning resources in regions where they are plentiful, have to migrate to regions where they are in scarce supply. The movement of people is a key flow. The movement of energy is a key flow. The movement of money, long-term, foreign direct investments, not flows in and out of stock markets, not commercial bank loans, foreign direct investment, equity ownership. And finally, the exporting of security, which only the United States can really do in any appreciable manner. Look at migrations first. Focus on populations. This is a population growth curve. There are some numbers in billions. Here's some history. This is where we've gone. When people want to scare the hell out of you, this is what they show you. We'll all be eating Soylent Green. These are the other scenarios. This is the best bet right now. Demographers are focusing on this scenario. What's interesting about this scenario is you get to 2050, I'll be 88 years old, starting the second half of my life. You will see us peak as a global population. Absolute turning point in human history. After that point, we begin to depopulate as a species. Great article not too long ago. Oh, New York Times, Sunday. China, the most populous country, facing a population shortage. They're going to age more rapidly than any country in human history, meaning they're more likely to get old before they get rich. Why is this important to us? 6 billion now. This is the spread. We love these guys because they work. Got more going in than coming out on this equation. Very important. This makes perfect sense mathematically if you think about it. We're going to have an equaling of young versus old in 2050. And from that point on, the old are going to outnumber the young. Absolutely amazing. Shouldn't happen in nature. The wolves should hunt us down, kill us in large enough numbers. By extension, why this matters to all of us. I like to say, I should be worrying about my PSR. I tend to worry about my PSA, but I should be worrying about my PSR. Why? Because I'm only 41 and I can still do something about it. Or let me say my wife can still do something about it. PSR is potential support ratio. Every working person for everybody in retirement. This is global history. In 1950, the number was 12 to 1. Still pretty rural and agrarian. With globalization 2, it gets you down to 9 to 1. Why? Most of the world hadn't joined globalization until very near the end of the process of the century. This is what happens when you get an old and new core coming together and 2/3 of humanity are deeply integrating in a global economy. That number comes down over the next 5 decades very dramatically. Now, a lot of assumptions in here. Major urbanization, huge upticks in technological productivity, people living longer, working longer. But you ask yourself, how are you going to manage that global PSR of 4 to 1 in 2050? What can come along, knock that baby off its pedestal? What can come along as a fix already in the works? We can track it, we can predict it with great accuracy. You distinguish between the old core, the new core, and the gap. PSRs across these 3 groups, dramatically different. 2 to 1 in the old core, 5 to 1 in the new core, still 10 to 1 here. Above replacement rate here in the 50th poorest countries in 2050. So no great mystery. You got to get people to move from the right to the left. Not just into the old core, but frankly into the new core too. And you're going to have to see a lot of jobs move in this direction. The politically sensitive issue of outsourcing. Third alternative, very interesting one, a global commute. My favorite example, covered in Wired magazine last year, the Philippines. 1/10 of its working age population works overseas. The government encourages this. They give them special holidays, free medical care, special communications, special rates on travel. What does it sound like? It sounds like how we get the U.S. military to be the largest global commuting force on the planet. Why is that no surprise? The Filipinos learned it from us. The original stewards on the ships. Right now they have 2 million workers in the United States. Annual basis, they take out $3 billion. Quadruple that number, get the actual impact on the Filipino economy. Multiplier effect. What Hispanics or Latin Americans send back to Latin America is 6 times what the Corps gives it in foreign aid. And that's keeping 95% of the money they earn here. They only send 5% back. And it's 6 times the aid the Corps sends to Latin America. This is enormously important. And again, all the things they use in the system to make this happen are the things that we're putting under attack after 9/11. The ability to travel freely, ability to communicate freely, ability to move money as freely as possible. Now let's talk about energy. I'm going to give you some huge numbers here. Quadrillion British thermal units. Quadrillion, sort of a Dr. Evil number. Nobody really knows what it means. It's just really big. Regions. 2001. North America has been #1, the global demand center, for as long as we can remember. Can't imagine a future that isn't like that. Here comes that future in one generation. We go up about 30% in energy requirements. Developing Asia doubles in one generation. That's a huge rule set shift. Let's look at that. Asia, 2025. Break it down. There's your transportation. Electricity, electricity, electricity. Quintupling of cars, China. 4-fold increase at least in electricity. Where are they going to need help? They got lots of coal. They know how to turn on a nuke. Don't need anybody's help there. Where they're going to need help, either to develop resources intra-region or to go out of region to buy those resources, is gas and oil. Already, 2/3 of the oil that comes out of the Persian Gulf goes to developing Asia. 2/3. How are they going to pay for that doubling of energy? Foreign direct investment. This is the outflow since the Second World War. $7 trillion roughly. Excuse me, this is the inward flow, meaning this is where the money has gone since the Second World War. This is where people like to invest. See if you can't spot my gap in the middle. Who's got the money? Who has sent the money outward? Tell me the Middle East is connected to the outside world. All those petrodollars. This is why I have trouble with the clash of civilizations theory. Because to get all that energy, the Asians have to be friends with the Slavs, the Muslims, and increasingly the Africans. To pay for all that energy and all the infrastructure associated with it, trillions of dollars worth of investment. They got to be friends with the Europeans and those crazy Americans, which pretty much only leaves Latinos for a clash of civilization. That's understanding global integration. If you think you can wage war with no understanding of that, then you're really not paying attention. But let's talk security and how we export it around the planet. Another stretching argument. I'll go back to the imperial heyday. And the old Corps, basically, in terms of its public sector exports, it exported administration. Basically, it kept the natives from getting too restless while it took the raw materials out at uncompetitive rates. It was called colonialization. Jump ahead. End of the Second World War. The surviving Corps' first order of business, resurrect those parts of the Corps you want to resurrect. Europe and Japan. Marshall Plan, NATO, the whole shebang. Over time, by the late 1950s, you have a resurrected Corps, much bigger than the surviving Corps that came out of World War II. And you see a new public sector export emerge. We create the U.S. Agency for International Development, OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation, Coordination, and Development. They create this category, official developmental aid. Foreign aid becomes a new public sector export, end of the 1950s, early 1960s. And then the Arabs get all that money with the oil, and you see a big transaction rate on arms, which we're still dealing with. The 1970s, the great heyday of arms transfers. You get to the globalization era. I'll argue you've got a surviving superpower and partners. Japan's sort of a head case right now, but I think they're coming out of it. Our main public sector export right now is security. You'll say it's technology. I'll tell you it's private sector. You'll say it's mass media content. I'll tell you it's private sector. The real public sector export is security. You'll say, what about foreign aid? I'll tell you foreign direct investment, which was half of official developmental aid at the beginning of the 1990s, is now 5-to-1 official developmental aid, meaning we send 5 times as much foreign direct investment to emerging markets and developing economies than we send official developmental aid. Why does this matter? Let me show you the conflicts across the 90s. Here's roughly 3 dozen. I'll give you annual per capita GDP. Here's the poorest countries, roughly half your conflicts. Here's your next level of poverty, basically all the rest. When you're talking about advanced states, you're not talking about much violence. And frankly, those are the 2 poorest neighborhoods there. So simple guy that I am, I'll argue. You get a country above 3,000 per capita GDP, they tend to get out of the violence business. How do you get them above that 3,000 per capita GDP? It's not official developmental aid. It's foreign direct investment. Why? Foreign direct investment needs security. Basic argument. Ray Vernon's product cycle. Any industry over time. Profits rise, peak, and then the labor gets too darn expensive. So you send the job overseas. We had a textile industry here in the United States. That was country A. It went to Mexico. That was country B. Then it went to China. That's country C, which is turning out to be country C for a lot of industries. Why? They crank out millions and millions of workers every year. So think about the global economy. Think about 3 big engines of job creation. EU, NAFTA, Japan, which is becoming a huge patron and mentor to the Chinese economy. And it's the demand of China that's pulled Japan finally out of that long-term recession. Where they send jobs, technology, investment, that's the core. Where they do not send it, that's basically the gap. Does this matter in terms of development? Absolutely. This is per capita income growth across the 1990s. Rich countries got richer. Big surprise. Globalizing economies got a lot richer. Non-globalizing economies got poorer. You'll say, all those globalizing economies produce is garbage. It's just manufactured raw materials. It's not really high-end goods. 20 years ago, you were right. 20 years ago, the globalizing economies, manufactured goods as a percentage of exports, only about 25%. 1 generation of foreign direct investment. This is the change. China's going to start exporting pickups and SUVs under the Great Wall name within the next couple of years. 9,000 to 18,000. Cars coming from China to the United States. So I agree with Jesse Helms on one point. Official developmental aid plus corruption equals a rat hole. But rule sets that attract foreign direct investment, that gets you real development. Why? Official developmental aid is an optimist. It hopes to change human behavior. Money is essentially a coward. If it gets scared, it runs away. That's what security enables. This is why the Middle East is screwed up, I will argue. It's poorly connected to the global economy. Basically, they send out oil, we send in money. Tom Friedman's cheap gas station argument. Interregional trade in the Middle East is the lowest in the world. It's lower than sub-Saharan Africa. The Middle East attracted a bigger percentage of global FDI 20 years ago than it does today. It accounted for more trade 20 years ago than it does today. Latin America, Asia, they moved off raw materials to manufacturing. Middle East has not. 8 of the 11 biggest economies in that region do not belong to the World Trade Organization. They are not synchronizing their rule sets. And they do not connect their money to the outside world. Meanwhile, their population has doubled in the last 20 years. Guess where this is going? Saudi Arabia had a per capita income about 28,000 20 years ago. It's 6,000 now. With a huge chunk of their population under the age of 15, it'll be below 3,000 very soon. And I guarantee you, you're going to see mass violence there. What do I mean by the exporting of security? Pretty simple stuff for this audience. You train their military leaders here. You exhibit presence. You cooperate with their militaries. You respond to crises. You do joint exercises. You pre-position equipment over there. You have permanent bases, alliances. Sometimes you go all the way to an occupation. My point is, you don't measure it in terms of bombs dropped. You measure it in terms of the attention we pay regions. Because that's what it really costs. How do I start wrapping this up? I'm going to make an argument about how we interact or transact with the outside world. The United States is a mere 5% of the world's population. 95% over there. Somehow we manage to expel a quarter of the world's pollution and garbage on the planet. Somehow we manage to burn a quarter of the world's energy. 5% of the world's population. I call that living large.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
Got to have that clip. Can't make the Wall Street Journal a liar. My friends on Wall Street say this is perfectly fair. We generate a quarter of the world's wealth. Another way to look at it. Economic footprint. We're experts at exporting sovereign debt. We do it better than anybody in the world. Allows us to live beyond our means. Of course, if you took $350 billion out of the U.S. federal budget, stopped paying for security around the planet, you'd have a different economy, I would argue. And a different world, unfortunately. My friends on Wall Street say, why do you bring this up in public? Do you know what it costs to print those little pieces of paper we send around the world? Nothing. They're just promises. What we get in return, computers, cars, it's a tremendous deal. I think the real transaction is we export security, we import connectivity. Global stability is a collective good. Why do we pay more for it than anybody else? Because we enjoy it more than anybody else. So how I view those major flows as transactions. We got to let their youth in. We got to give them opportunity because we're going to age. That's an essential transaction we have to pursue. You put in a Patriot Act, you divert the flow of Latinos coming to the United States that are supposed to account for 2/3 of our population growth between now and 2050, you're changing human history. Because they're going to the Iberian Peninsula now, in Europe, because they feel more welcome there, in far larger numbers than we anticipated, since 9/11. Unanticipated consequence. We're exchanging our security for their instability. So we are going to firewall ourselves off from some of the worst things inside the gap. Can't grow the core unless you protect the core. Their energy matters to us, even if it is in an extended fashion. Price of energy goes up in China, price of goods goes up in Walmart. That's how it works. And with our money, we exchange for their development. And we buy off the only long-term threat that really matters, China. So think about those four flows. Core gap, what has to happen? Essentially, people got to go from the gap to the core in large numbers. Security's got to go from the old core, specifically in the first instance to the Middle East, increasingly throughout the gap. But first, focus on the Middle East because a lot of energy's got to come out of here over the next 25 years before we move on to hydrogen. And the long-term investments have to continue to integrate this half the world's population over here. That is the baby we cannot throw out with the bathwater in this global war on terrorism. So I am concerned very much when we don't have Indians and Chinese and Russians as part of the occupation force in Iraq. It's a real problem. It's a strategic error. Start wrapping it up. We master this new definition of crisis and instability so we understand how to wage war within the context of everything else. We screw up any one of these flows, we could screw up the system. We have destroyed globalization before, and we can definitely do it again. We have to understand that when we wage war, we administer to a system. I see it as a three-pronged strategy. 1, strengthen the core's ability to withstand system perturbations like 9/11. 2, firewall the core off from the gap's worst exports. 3, you got to shrink the gap. Only a small portion of it involves military actions. The vast bulk of it is foreign direct investment. The vast bulk. Here's the stuff that gets the most play now in the book, which frankly I wasn't going to put into the book because I thought it was a little too far out there. But events in Iraq make it a lot more relevant. Make an argument, again, another stretching one. Difference between defense and security. Historically, defense means take care of the homeland. And as Art Sabrowski likes to say, security means everything else. I could do this for $100 billion. We spend $350 billion over here. Historically, we had two different forces to do that. It's written in the Constitution. Raise an army, maintain a navy. Your big stick force, your baton stick force with the Marines. Your can of whoop-ass, how you keep the system functioning. We decided in 1947 to put those two together. Why? Because we believed, correctly, we were going to be involved in a long-term hair-trigger standoff with the Soviets. And so we merged the definition of America's national defense and the whole world going up in flames. Won't argue with that definition. Problem is, that definition no longer holds. What has happened since the end of the Cold War? What has happened is basically that bifurcation I described earlier. Operating one military, buying another. Gets harder over time. It'll get very hard over the next year in Iraq. Very hard. We've been having these arguments ever since the end of the Cold War. Let's go back to what we had before. As somebody at the Naval War College, we like the idea. Some people think 9/11 really triggered the bifurcation. Home game, Homeland Security. Away game, Department of Defense. I believe the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was a strategic error. I don't think it's going to increase coordination whatsoever. I think we're going to waste a lot of money. We're going to feel good about it. But any notion of putting up walls between us and the outside world is a waste of time. The shock of 9/11 should have pushed us into embracing the world, not pulling back from the world. I knew when we went into Iraq, we would defeat the Iraq army with ease, and that we'd probably screw up the occupation badly. Why? Because we don't have a back half force. And because we don't have a back half force, we don't get those 17,000 peacekeepers from India, which basically says, you know what? I don't think you got it. I think the occupation of Iraq is transforming transformation. And I think it's about time we admit that we have, living uncomfortably inside the Department of Defense, both a Department of War and a Department of everything else. I think Don Rumsfeld is an amazing Secretary of War. I don't think we have a secretary for everything else. And that's how you get Abu Ghraib. That's how you get all the screw-ups in Iraq. We don't have a secretary for everything else. Two missions fundamentally at odds. We need a Leviathan force for that Hobbesian world called the Gap. That force is going to win you wars. We also need a peace-waging force. The back half force. What does this mean? In practical terms, divorce is unlikely anytime soon. I say they'll stay together for the sake of the children. Nobody wants the Marines to be orphaned. But I do advocate, for example, totally obliterating service identities once you become a flag. Nobody joins the U.S. military. They join the Marines, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. I believe in that processing function. But I believe once you achieve flag rank, you better be able to do it all. People tell me that can't be done. I say you haven't been paying attention to jointness over the last 10 years. As I proceed in this discussion, I'll talk about what I consider to be an extant situation that's only going to get more dramatic over time. I call it the sleeping in separate bedrooms arrangement. Two forces uncomfortably lodged inside the Department of Defense. And every once in a while they bump into each other on the battlefield when an essential civilian, Jessica Lynch, wanders into a fire zone. We say, how did that happen? And you get Pete Schoomaker, new Chief of Staff of the Army, saying, we're going to make everybody a rifleman in the Army. We don't have that many rifles. We don't have that many bullets. Two different forces, two very different functions. We've been trying to do the same with one military throughout the 90s. It's not easy. Read all the articles, the great articles in the Times, and the Post and the Journal about what it is for these guys to try to do both jobs day and night. Some people say the Brits do it. The Brits aren't the U.S. military in terms of size. What's amazing is, when our forces get to do this stuff, they come back with very high reenlistment rates. They feel very good about sysadmin work. So don't tell me we can't find the people for that right-hand force, because I know we can. But you can't take them under the circumstances of this, especially the reserve component, then send them over for extended duties, and oh, by the way, you might have to slip back into this, because we didn't shut down the war very effectively. Other differences. The Leviathan force has traditional partners who all look suspiciously like the United Kingdom and their former colonies, which is without surprise. They're multinational states, like in India, like a Canada, Australia, United States. These partners, much different, much wider array. This is your jointness. This is so much more. Interagency. I call this your dad's military. I call this your mom's military. Your dad's military, Leviathan force, I want them young, male, unmarried, slightly pissed off. They like Nintendo, I say great. I got a 9-year-old they can have right now. This is going to be older, married with children, more educated, gender balanced. This one is not coming under the purview of the International Criminal Court. This one is. This one will not move in the direction of civilian law, but remain very distinct from society and military law. This one will move in the direction of civilian law, become more like cops. This one will respect the restrictions, posse comitatus, military forces operating inside the United States. This force is going to obliterate those distinctions over time. These are the ground troops for your Northern Command. Leviathan force will not hold press conferences. Sysadmin force will be open source. Different definitions of network. And then the command arrangements. This is how you make sense of Dana Priest's work. Washington Post. They're your proconsuls. They've been doing sysadmin around the world for years. All we have to do is admit it. Your combatant commanders, the biggest foreign policy budgets in the U.S. government, dwarfing that estate. And then look at what the vice chairman, Peter Pace, is doing in terms of long-term war planning. You're going to see that war-fighting force drawn back into these previously supporting commands. You're going to see that force commanded increasingly by a joint forces command. And that's going to be the big stick we break out every so often. Whereas this is the force that's never coming home. Now the best slide. Who gets the kids? This is the part in the brief where the Marines go, Gah! This makes perfect sense historically. Small arms, small wars. This is what these guys have been doing throughout their history. This is why this is not going to be a toothless force. The Marines are like my West Highland Terrier. They get up every morning, they want to dig a hole, and they want to kill something. So it's not going to be a toothless force. Absolutely not. And it returns to their historical roots. Now let's talk the Navy. Submarines, strategic, go over here to the Leviathan force. Surface combatants, sysadmin force. We move progressively toward what I call the smart dust Navy. based on our experience in tracking things with Soviet subs. We need to get global on that basis. Carriers go in both directions. Why? Because I work for the Naval War College. I'd like to have my contract picked up. Now, they go in both directions because they're just so darn good. Same thing with airborne, same principle. Your big armor goes towards the Leviathan. Your ground troops, by and large, go to sysadmin. So I believe in the transformed force that largely wins from the air and decimates the opponent. But you got to have lots of boots on the ground for the sysadmin work, for the peace waging. And then the Air Force. Your logistics, both directions, just like carriers and airborne. You see the similarities. But your fighters and your bombers, they're the Leviathan force. And then special ops, distinct from Marine Corps. They are really your assassination squad, they're your leave behind force, they're your first in, last out. That's how it breaks down. Last slide. Definition of transformation. Art Zabrowski likes to say it's a three-headed monster. Inside the Pentagon, it's mostly about buying stuff. That's what the Hill cares about. To hell with your vision, do you build it in my district? Inside the E-ring, it's all about running the Defense Department better. The revolution in business affairs. This is the one that's really changing. The role of the Defense Department in national security. Best question I ever got in response to this brief came from Esquire staff, which, after they told me to stop wearing button-down shirts with formal suits, a very important rule, asked the question, in your vision of the future, what changes more? These are the answers we came up with. We think the rest of the world is going to change more than the United States. It's not about building Fortress America. It's about raising security practices outside, which is why I believe in the virtual border concept. And I believe in tracking containers at where they start, not where they come. Private sector is going to change a whole lot more than the public sector. Private sector has a hard time with security as a collective good. They consider it a sunk cost. They hate it. You want to see a good example of private sector security? It's called security at airports before 9/11. The U.S. government as a whole is going to change more than the Defense Department. These guys have to aggregate a lot of disparate skill sets. All I'm talking about in this bifurcation is returning to what we know throughout our history. Interagency is going to change a whole lot more than jointness. Interagency is the new jointness. Peacekeeping is going to change a whole lot more than warfighting, which is still about smoking holes. And military operations are going to change a whole lot more than what we buy or how we buy it. Now, we send the defense budget over to the Hill. We call it a transformation budget. And the military expenditure force structure weenies come out of their little cubby holes in the think tanks around Washington. And they say, I'm a transformation expert. And I say, how do we know you're a transformation expert? They say, I've memorized every line of the U.S. defense budget. That makes me a transformation expert. So they say, I've gone through your defense budget. I've looked at every line. I don't see transformation anywhere. Show me where it is. We say, maybe you need a larger perspective. Because maybe there's all sorts of change going on throughout the system. But you're not paying attention to it because you only define it in terms of programs of record. The whack list. And that has to end if we're going to understand transformation, if we're going to understand the seam between war and peace, if we're going to succeed in reaching a finishing line in this global war on terrorism, which I'll define as making globalization truly global, connecting the disconnected, ending the threat as we know it. If you want to find out more about the work, come to the War College website for the war stuff. Come to my personal website for the everything else. I won't try to bias you in terms of which website's better. Suffice it to say that thanks to the brilliance of the U.S. Navy Marine Corps intranet, I have a very secure system now. I can talk and interact with almost nobody. Be happy to turn it open to questions at this point. And you got a hard time at 11:30 because that's when the picnic begins, I believe. Sir.
Chip Gerald from the CIA. Mm-hmm. Where and how do you see the intelligence community and the parts of it, you know, the ints, humint, et cetera, fitting into this new paradigm, and how does it work in the way you're looking at it?
Right. I see a similar bifurcation in the intelligence community. I'd like to see DIA remain fundamentally, Defense Intelligence Agency, and all the service intelligence agencies remain fundamentally in the Leviathan warfighting business. Why? Because I think they're largely incompetent in everything else. So I think they should stick with what they know. Okay? I see the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the other aspects that are more network focused, like the overhead assets and whatnot, I see that moving progressively into an unclassified environment. I'd like to see the CIA fundamentally become what it was originally designed to be, a central intelligence agency, instead of this puzzle palace where information goes in and not much comes out. I think the real model for the CIA is the National Intelligence Council, which is open source, interacts with academics and the unclassified world very openly, produces what I consider to be the best intelligence in the community, by far. So I'd like to see the CIA become a lot more like the National Intelligence Council, the NIC, and I'd like to see that CIA and the NIC fundamentally serve the sysadmin force and see the military intelligence agencies stick with the warfighting, because I think that's what they know and do well. Sir?
I'm Brigadier Ali Khan, and don't be surprised if I tell you that I'm from Pakistan. Mm-hmm. What was interesting in this gap was that it covered the entire Muslim world. Not a soul left out of the Muslim world, actually.
Actually, there's quite a few Muslims inside the core. Tens and tens of millions of them.
Yeah, but as far as the Muslim countries are concerned, they're all included.
Predominantly Muslim countries are inside the gap.
Yeah.
Correct.
And leaving a small portion of the South Central America and a portion of the South and Central and South Africa, I think it's by and large the Muslim world.
I disagree. I don't think it's by and large a Muslim world.
No. What I'm saying is that the gap includes.
And I'm disagreeing. I don't think the totality of the gap can be logically defined as the Muslim world. I would argue that any religion you find inside the gap is more fundamentalist than the version of that religion inside the core. Whether you're talking Christianity, evangelicals, Judaism, or Muslims. Okay?
Okay, I will not drag this down. But what I'm saying is that the Muslim world is included in this.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Now, the problem that I have been trying to grapple with during this last 1 year that I was here is that to what extent do the West really understands why is the Muslim world the way it is? Mm-hmm. Why is there such instability in this particular region? When you and me are working on a project with two different aims, totally different aims, there's very little common ground that we will find between the two of us. Now, this is actually related to the fundamental question of existence on which the Muslim world looks at it from a very different angle, from a very different standpoint, and with a very different purpose. When there are such vast differences, democracy is okay, one thing, but let me tell you that we in the Muslim world look at secularism being imposed on the Muslim world rather than democracy and the liberal values of the West. And that is what really creates the resentment. That is what is being talked here as an anti-American phenomena or anti-West phenomena.
Okay.
It is basically this problem. And my humble conclusion is that, and this is after a lot of research, that there's very little that the West understands about what Islam is all about. And this I can say with authority because I carried out a lot of research. I talked to a lot of people here during this past 1 year. You may have a different level of understanding because of...
I have a different perspective, definitely.
Yeah, okay. Now, this is my first question, that why is it that we see this, or why is it that we fail to see this, this lack of understanding, and we still say that what we think is the right thing? After all, some of the greatest empires in the world or in history were founded on this very philosophy, and they prospered. My second question to you is that 9/11 has been actually a watershed, or whatever you call it. And you said new rule sets emerged from this. And the last attacks in Spain and the sophistication with which they were conducted, if it was Al-Qaeda behind these attacks, are a good indication that Al-Qaeda is not only well and alive, but that it's going about its business as usual. So what if, God forbid, if a 9/11 can be repeated, what will then happen if we can have a new set rule after this one's first 9/11? How do you see the world going then, and in which direction? And what will happen to the liberties and individual freedom that we so proudly cherish?
Right. In terms of the first question, the difference between what could be described as the West, or quote-unquote more modern societies, and Islam in general, is that Islam has remained a traditional society, I would argue trapped in history. And the fundamental difference between where Islam stopped and where the rest of the world went ahead is more in gender and sex relations than it is in differences, fundamental differences in terms of political ideas. We have good polling data that suggests very clearly that it's not our political ideals that the Middle East finds reprehensible. That they also welcome the notion of democracy and pluralism and representative government. That's not the difference. The real profound difference is over gender issues and the nature of the role of women in society and what's considered to be the promiscuous and decadent lifestyle of the West. So it really comes down to sex far more than it does politics. The extension of the global economy occurs in countries that frankly liberate their females into the labor pool. That's the difference. And the Middle East has fundamentally not liberated its female population into its labor pool. And that's the big thing holding it back. You want to go back and look at the Asian miracle? It's mostly South Korea and Singapore and Japan, a lot of these countries opening up the notion of who gets to serve in the labor pool, and that generates far higher levels of productivity, and that's what really integrates them with the outside world. So it fundamentally comes down to, I would argue in a global war on terrorism, you're going to be battling males who stand in the way of globalization's creeping embrace of their traditional societies and what it will do to the role of women and family structures, which in the eyes of many in that part of the world will be extremely destabilizing. Do I think the West has no understanding of that? I think the West went through that decades, and in some instances centuries ago. I think it's a matter of remembering all these issues and all the pain and all the anguish at that sort of change. I think we're very familiar with it. I don't think we don't understand it. I think we've forgotten it fundamentally. So that's my take on the real differences between Islam and the rest of the world. In terms of what would happen if there was another 9/11 in the United States, that's a subject of great inquiry. Politically, I think Americans have a tendency to rally around the flag very strongly in those situations. I think if it happened right up in the run-up to the election, that Bush would probably carry the day pretty strongly, and that you would see even more shifts in the direction of order versus justice. And you'd see us erring on that side. I think it's very hard to pull off a 9/11. I think since we've engaged a global war on terrorism, the Middle Eastern terrorist networks are back to what they did in the 70s, which is they can reach into southern Europe, and they really can't go much further. So there have not been attacks in the United States. And most of the attacks that we've seen since 9/11 have been in the Middle East, which is where I prefer to see them, because I think that's where the grievances lie. I mean, ultimately, what they're trying to do is destabilize the governments there, take them over, and hijack them from humanity. And so I think as long as we have that conflict occurring in the Middle East versus Boston, New York, Washington, it's a good deal for the United States. And as long as we have professionals waging that war, instead of U.S. civilians coming under attack, I think that's why everybody got in the business of national security in the first place, to see that professionals do their jobs. So I would prefer, and I can put this as cynically as you want, I would prefer to lose 700 professionals over a period of time versus suffering 3, 5, 10, 25 if they got lucky, 50,000 U.S. civilian casualties. Because I know that will really distort this society and distort this political system. Whereas what it does to the U.S. military over time, I think it'll force us to transform our definitions of transformation, and we'll get better. Because I know of no institution, almost in the history of humanity, that learns better and more quickly from failure than the U.S. military. So I'm very optimistic on that score. Question, please.
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Kim Kreider, U.S. Air Force. I'd like to go back to your last slide. You gave us a lot of great things to think about this morning. And the last slide, where we talk about what's going to change more, leaves me a little bit wondering, can we really get there from here? Because some of the things that you set up in terms of what would change more, operations are going to change more than acquisition, kind of takes us back to, are we buying one war and fighting in another, in my mind. I'm wondering, are we going to get there from here? You know, we tend to be a fairly impatient society. And what are going to be some of the triggers that might lunge us forward in the direction where we need to go?
Okay. To me, the discussion of how fast this occurs inside the U.S. military and inside the U.S. national security establishment as a whole is much like the discussion of how quickly do we get to hydrogen cars. When you talk to people on Wall Street, and the business attitude is, it's never going to happen until the economics work. Never going to happen, never going to happen, never going to happen. Then the economics work, and they say, you know what? We're there. And their whole mindset changes that afternoon. We're going to hit those kinds of tipping points in a variety of venues. Again, it will happen within the construct of a single generation of leadership, I would argue. I remember when, in the early 90s, we declared ourselves joint. In fact, I had a big struggle with a friend of mine, Vice Admiral Snuffy Smith, because I wrote a piece that said the Navy's not very joint. He said, damn it, Barnett, I signed a piece of paper that said we were joint. We're going to sign pieces of paper that say all sorts of things. But how it's really going to happen over the next 10 years is going to be through how we alter the career paths of the flag officers, the generals and the admirals, by and large. So getting joint tickets punched in your career in order to make it to 4-star dramatically transformed, I would argue, the nature of the leadership on top, by my argument. Because I remember the guys who were around as flags at the end of the Cold War, and they looked like dinosaurs compared to the crew we got now. And when I talk to the 04s and the 05s, the captains and the colonels of today, I mean, they not only get how to send email, they know how the internet works. So when you talk net-centric warfare with them, I mean, it's not gobbledygook, as Paul Van Riper might think it is. So I see the change coming far more rapidly than people imagine. And I see the quickest ways to get there, again, not trying to manipulate the acquisition so much, but manipulating the career paths. So when they put in these new policies in the transformation bill, which were largely ignored because people said, other than Crusader, what's getting cut? I don't see transformation. I saw huge changes in how they can deal with the career paths of admirals and generals. And I think that will have more impact. And it was very little noticed in that transformation bill of a year back. Very little notice compared to the force structure issues. But that's what will really change things. I think the experience in Iraq is going to transform us tremendously. I think whenever you try to set off what I call a system perturbation, you end up getting changed more than your target. So I think we're going to change faster and in some ways more profoundly than the Middle East, just like I think bin Laden's whole network got transformed by 9/11 in ways that he could scarcely imagine. I do counter, though, the notion, and I'm kind of amazed when we see this discussion, and it sort of gets back to your question a little bit, about Al-Qaeda still functioning quite well and still doing a lot of things. I mean, when I see people like the head of the ACLU, and I say that as somebody whose wife is a card-carrying member, when I see him on television saying, you know what, acts of terrorism have actually gone up since 9/11. You know, I just want to scream out kind of a Homer Simpson, duh, when I hear that kind of argument. It's sort of like somebody coming to FDR in 1943 and saying, you know what, we've been fighting a war with Japan for 24 months, and somehow there are more Japanese fighting and more attacks from Japan now than there were before Pearl Harbor. I mean, if you're going to engage your enemy, he's going to ramp up his activity, you're going to ramp up your activity. So this notion that we're going to somehow, I mean, we call it a war, but we're still applying police statistics to it in terms of incidences of crime. Why isn't terrorism going down? Why? Because we're accelerating, I would argue, the penetration of the Middle East by the forces of globalization. And it will turn traditional societies on their heads. And it will be very non-gender neutral because it will empower women far more in comparison to men in traditional societies. So it's going to be very tumultuous. To watch the spread of globalization is to watch tumult and political unrest and civil strife. And it's going to happen whether you're there or not. I mean, globalization is going into the Middle East. It's going into Africa. It's going into Latin America in a big way. It's going to create violence and antipathy and people trying to fight it desperately, tooth and nail, whether we're there or not. If we're not there, I think it's going to go much worse. And I think it can actually stall. I think it can get to be very static lines. And I fear a Middle East that has not much difference in terms of its attractiveness to the rest of the world as a Central Africa does today in 20 years when we move off oil as a fundamental source for transportation and we start moving towards natural gas to get hydrogen for cars. So I think we're running a variety of races. I think bin Laden's running a race. He knows if he can't disconnect the Middle East in 20 years, there won't be the society he wants to take back in time. It won't be there anymore because the women will be far more integrated in society, and you'll see a lot more individual freedom, and there'll be a lot more connectivity and communication with the outside world, and you won't be able to take it back in time. But I also see the United States and the West and the rest of the core running a race to connect the Middle East before it gets lost on the slim connectivity that it has today being evaporated by our move towards hydrogen. And so I think these are the big compelling issues of the day. That's why I think it's so essential that we treat transformation within this larger context and understand it for what it really is, so that it has urgency. Please.
Captain Mike Seifert, Navy. On your sysadmin side, you showed us how the military gets divided up.
Right.
What about the rest of the interagency, which is going to have to, I guess, predominantly go to the sysadmin side?
Right.
Now, how do they transform so that they can work well with the military side that's there to make this sysadmin function work?
I don't have any simple answers for that one. I mean, I think a lot of them have been mistakenly trapped inside a Department of Homeland Security and had their vision limited on that basis. I think, obviously, a lot of them have been starved for funds since the end of the Cold War. USIA, Information Agency, U.S. Agency for International Development. I think, by and large, they're trapped in a State Department mindset, which has to be dramatically overhauled, because I think the State Department is essentially defined and organized for a 19th century reality, which is why we tend to have, I would argue, thinkers coming out of that venue that are very uncomfortable with this world that we live in now and very resistant to the kinds of things that this administration has tried to achieve, which is why I think there's tremendous tension between state and defense, and that it isn't simply a matter of Rumsfeld versus Powell and personalities. I think those tensions are going to remain very dramatically. I think the sysadmin force should look to a lot of those agencies, though, for how it defines itself. So I don't think they have to change so much as DoD has to move in that direction increasingly. The real model I have for the sysadmin force is the Coast Guard. Not quite military, not quite civilian. Under military law, sort of. Under civilian law, sort of. Are they a warfighting force, sort of? Are they a police force, sort of? Are they exquisitely, bureaucratically multilingual? Absolutely. Do they deal with all entities of the government and all foreign entities? Absolutely. I think they provide a lot of the future. That's why I think it's going to be hard, for example, for the U.S. Navy to move in that direction, because they're very reticent to return to what they see as, Coast Guard days of the past. But I think essentially the Navy will move in the direction of being the Coast Guard to the world, because I think the Coast Guard is going to be fundamentally, due to internal politics, sucked back in towards the United States. One more question. Sir?
Tim Arcano, Department of the Navy. Sir, you mentioned briefly metrics. I'd be interested in your insights in how we might define the end of the global war on terrorism that could theoretically last for decades and decades. And as well, how do we measure how well we're doing that? You had mentioned before the number of terrorist attacks, which I would argue that that number isn't necessarily representative of how we're doing.
No. I would argue where they occur. So I think it's successful to date since 9/11 that they're occurring in the Middle East, and the range of their occurrence is back to what it was in the 70s. meaning Southern Europe, and that, just the extension of the greater Middle East. I think that's progress. I think over time, real progress in a global war on terrorism will see that shift downward towards sub-Saharan Africa. Because I think what bin Laden represents is fundamentally the latest version of resistance to the spread of the globalist, the global capitalist economy. And increasingly, that resistance has gone farther back in time. I mean, the Bolsheviks tried to take down the Germans in the First World War, and they decided that was too close to capitalism, so they went back in time, took down Russia. Mao went back in time even further, took down China. We've seen even more progressive retreats into time. I think bin Laden is kind of an ultimate, and al-Qaeda ultimate retreat in time. I mean, their promise of the future is sort of a 7th century paradise that's almost pre-economic. Young men in madrasas and young women pretty much disconnected from any sort of economic activity, any education, any role outside the home. I mean, I think that's so far back in time that the only way that resistance can survive is as we drive them out of countries that are integrated into the global core over time, they increasingly retreat to even more disconnected areas. So progress for me in a global war on terrorism would be those bombs and those terrorist attacks, that locus of activity shifting southward into sub-Saharan Africa, because I think we're going to be fighting the same crowd in Central Africa 20 years from now. And it'll be like hunting down the last Japanese guy on some island 20 years after World War II. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very much. Thank you. I think you all agree we've been given a little bit to think about this morning. Take a good lunch break. You've got your picnic. We'll be back in here. Please be back in here at 13:25, and we'll go at 13:30. Laura Anderson, KPMG, followed by Greg Cudahy of Capgemini. And then Tom will return for a panel where we get another shot at all of our speakers today to end the day. Thank you very much for your attention.
After Jim, 2 hours, baby. Good.